Morning and welcome to the 9th Annual Conference of the Virginia Children's Services Act. I'm Scott Reiner, and I have the honor of serving as the Executive Director of the Office of Children's Services, where our team is dedicated to the purpose of empowering communities to serve youth. If we were meeting in person, I would likely be a bit more nervous, as I would be standing in front of close to 1,000 registered participants, our largest number ever. But as one of the changes brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, I am now turned into a YouTube star, speaking only to the webcam and my own face on the monitor in front of me. I'm not sure that makes me any less nervous though. Thanks to all of you here in the cloud, spending your valuable time with us the next 2 mornings. More importantly, I want to recognize your everyday efforts in carrying out the CSA's mission to provide a child-centered, family-focused, and community-based system of care for Virginia's children and families. While it would be my greatest hope that the pandemic never happened or simply went away quickly, the reality is that we are all impacted. We would typically be together for 2 full days in multiple breakout sessions, networking, collecting all the great giveaways from our sponsors, and sharing a few meals. I hope that we will be back together again in person for the 10th annual CSA conference next year. We do have an excellent, though abbreviated, program for you these next 2 days. After our keynote presentation, which opens our morning today, we have 3 sessions. 1 will be today and 2 tomorrow morning. These sessions address how our major service sectors, schools, child welfare, and behavioral health have navigated the pandemic and how they plan to continue those adaptations in the future. Our presenters represent state and local governments and our partners from the private sector, and I'm sure you will learn something valuable from each of them. I want to thank all of the programs supporting this conference. I hope you take a few minutes to visit their websites, which you can find through the conference program, the breakout rooms that will happen after lunch today, and the videos that they have linked through the conference program. Thanks to the team from Virginia Tech who helped make me a YouTube star and played an invaluable role in bringing this conference from concept to reality. For some additional opening remarks, we are privileged this morning to have Secretary of Health and Human Resources Daniel Carey with us. The Secretary's biographic notes are in your program, so I will not read them other than to highlight a few things. Dr. Carey leads the 12 agencies in the HHR portfolio, including many of the state agencies that are at the very front lines in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Carey is the chair of the State Executive Council for Children's Services, or the SEC, which is the governing body of the CSA, and he has jumped into that work with both feet. Secretary Carey is a physician by profession, more specifically a cardiologist. I point this out because while he leads with intellect, he also leads with heart. He continually challenges us not only to think through problems, but to also maintain equal appreciation for the impact of those problems and the proposed solutions on the people we serve, the citizens of Virginia, often those most in need of support from our government. This leading with heart also applies to his relationships with agency leadership like myself. He's always asking how he can serve more effectively as a leader. This is a rare quality and one that I personally appreciate, and I'm trying my best to emulate. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce to you this morning the Secretary of Health and Human Resources, Dr. Daniel Carey.
Well, good morning, and Scott, thank you so very much for those very kind remarks. And I'm so excited for this privilege to help open the festivities. And it's really a pleasure to be with you all today and inviting me to speak. And I am deeply honored to be with you all, albeit virtually. You know, in my office, we often discuss how children and families are our most vulnerable and high-risk population. Even before this pandemic, for too many of our families in Virginia struggled. Child welfare, education, healthcare, and behavioral health services are critical resources. during an unpredictable time, making sure that services remain steady provides stability and structure. Your programs have adapted and innovated to continue serving families throughout this pandemic, and will keep connecting children, youth, and families to resources and the support they need. We could not have gotten through this pandemic without your partnership, and thank you all for your tireless efforts. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the strategic plan and then maybe some personal reflections on the pandemic before turning it over to the great program you have before you today. As Scott mentioned, as the chair of the State Executive Council, I have had a unique perspective into the working of the CSA and have had a hand in its mission of collaborative, child-centered, family-focused, community-based system of care that effectively meets the needs of youth and their families in the Commonwealth. The recently adopted SEC strategic plan brought together state agency leaders from across 3 secretariats, HHR, education, as well as public safety, local government partners, legislators, the judicial branch, private providers, parents, and service recipients to critically examine where we are as a system and where we want to go. The key elements of that strategic plan include: 1, increasing alignment in policy and practice across agencies and service sectors, including a critical focus on being more equitable and trauma-informed as a system. 2, advancing better outcomes for children and families by supporting the cross-agency work to implement effective evidence-based services, including a focus on being able to measure what we are doing. 3, supporting local implementation of the CSA by identifying key skills needed by local CSA leaders and practitioners, and then supporting those practitioners and leaders through training and other resources. And fourth and finally, enhancing the experience of families and service recipients by developing tools to assist with their ability to easily access the CSA process and to obtain the needed help for their children. This will not be a plan that is sedentary or sitting to collect dust on the shelf. It is a guiding document that is actively worked, monitored, and adjusted as needed by both staff at the OCS as well as by the whole SEC. And it will take collaboration from each of us in obtaining these goals. And I look forward to our continued work together. Thank you all again to every individual that touches the CSA and its mission. I cannot imagine a more challenging time. And I can say in my own journey as helping to lead the response in Virginia of this pandemic, I have seen my own dark days back in April and May when we were struggling with our contact tracing numbers, with our testing numbers, and it was unclear which way to turn. I had to lean on my colleagues and lean on my team to help find those solutions and to help buoy me up. And frankly, not exercising and not taking care of myself led to me being less resilient than I needed to be. And I share that just because this continues to be a long emergency. And while we are hopeful for when we will have vaccines available and other interventions to allow us to return to a more normal, whether it's schools or other services, we know that it's not next week or next month. And I personally came to realize what I think we all know is that turning to each other for help is indeed one of the greatest strengths that we can have, and that we need to rely on each other and be buoyed up by each other and thereby get strength for the journey ahead. And one of my favorite poets, Wendell Berry, I think said it better than I can. I thought I would share that with you this morning. In his poem, The Real Work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. So I think that poem for me is both reassuring and challenging. And again, we need to realize and put into practice, both in the services that we provide, as well as in our own lives and our work, realize that reaching out for help is really a tremendous strength. And I could not imagine us getting through this pandemic and all of the incredible ripple effects that are challenging families throughout Virginia without leaning on each other. And indeed, it is only together that we will get through this. So I wish you a tremendous meeting today and tomorrow. I know you're in for a tremendous treat with Dr. Underwood, and I'll let the program continue. But thank you so much. I get so much inspiration from the work that you continue to do under the most challenging circumstances. So best wishes and have a wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Carey. And I'm just trying to, for a minute, absorb the wealth in what you've shared with us. And it's clear to me, and I'm sure to everyone else out there, why our response and why our efforts here in Virginia have been so effective with your leadership, and how greatly I appreciate that on behalf of everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. And so next, we have our keynote speaker. And Dr. Janice Underwood is the Commonwealth's Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. She is actually the Commonwealth and the nation's first ever cabinet-level Chief Diversity Officer, appointed by Governor Northam just over a year ago in September 2019. Her many accomplishments and credentials can be found in your conference program. Dr. Underwood has a broad charge to help develop Virginia into a national leader in becoming an inclusive state where all people can live, learn, work, visit, and thrive. You will hear from her about where these efforts stand in a moment. We had invited Dr. Underwood to open our conference long before being hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, as the importance of equity was critical to our work in CSA in what I now call the BCE, or that's the before COVID era. It was equally important then as it is today, but the pandemic and the events shining a spotlight on systemic racial biases in our country have laid bare the depth of our need, with open eyes and open hearts, to honestly confront the impacts of inequity, not only in the criminal justice system, but in healthcare and education, just to name a few. Dr. Underwood approaches this work with unmatched passion and energy. I always leave any conversation with her re-energized to do my part, whatever that might be, in moving us forward toward a community in which equality of opportunity is the standard. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Underwood to get our conference off to a flying start. Please take it away, Janice Underwood.
Well, thank you, Scott, so much for that kind introduction, and a special shout out to the Office of Children's Services. It is so great to be with you all virtually and properly socially distanced. I'm elbow bumping all 1,000 of you, and so it's good to be with you. Thank you, Secretary Carey, for the invitation to come and speak in concert with Scott. And I'm just happy to be with you all, because these are conversations we're having all over the Commonwealth. And before the pandemic, we were having them in person. But the good thing about this is that we did not let the pandemic stop us. People like you and me, we're still having these conversations, and I think we're having them in a more honest way, because the time is right to always do what's right. So thank you and good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about my office. I'm going to talk a little bit about me, and I'm going to ask that you put on your hat, or the lens through which you do your work, as you consume these short few comments. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So I believe, Zandra, you have a PowerPoint that you're going to display?
Yes, we have.
If you could go ahead and cue that up and let's get started.
Okay.
So as Zandra's bringing up the PowerPoint, to everyone in virtual land, please do feel free to put questions in the chat. Maybe there are other questions you pre-submitted, but we're really just going to have a robust conversation. I believe dialogue is the only way to move us from point A to point B and all the way down to Z. So at the end of the day and then at the beginning of the next, we have to work together. We have to understand that there's more that unites us than divides us. And quite candidly, that is never more clear. We have a lot going on in our landscape, in Virginia and nationally. And so I'm looking forward to a conversation. Let's see. And Michaela, if you don't have the slides to them, please feel free to send those slides. I'll just go ahead and get started. I'll just get started. My name is Janice Underwood, as was mentioned, and I'm so honored to have been appointed by the 73rd Governor of Virginia as the nation's first Chief Diversity Officer in a governor's cabinet. I will share with you that given what we've learned about the pandemic, given what we've learned and all saw back in May, the awful death and murder of George Floyd and so many others, there has been a call for justice. There's been a call for reckoning and racial reconciliation, and really thinking about how structural racism makes all other forms of oppression possible. So when you think of all the dimensions of diversity and all the other forms of oppression, structural racism that started in our country, in our state 401 years ago, really makes all those forms of inequity possible and rampant and endemic. And so as we think about what are we going to do about it, we continue to talk about it, but what do we do? How can we make action? And I'm grateful for the clairvoyance and leadership of Governor Northam and the entire administration, who said, you know, we're going to do things in a more robust and transformative way, and we're going to lead the nation and really think about innovative ideas and solutions. And to Secretary Kerry's point, he's openly shared that we have to start doing things differently. We have to understand that the way and the systems upon which we all operate in were built inequitably on purpose. And so what are we going to do about it? And so thank you, Scott, for having me so that we can have these conversations. I'm going to share a little bit about my equity story. And the reason why I want to do that is because I want to do that in the sense of modeling my equity story, so that as you work in your capacity and in your sphere of influence, that you will form your own equity story and in fact share it with others. If you were seeing my slides, if the slides were up, you would see a picture of me walking out on the first day of my being announced by Governor Northam as the nation's first cabinet level Chief Diversity Officer. The picture was captured by the governor's photographer, Jack Mayer. And the picture, when I reflected back on it, there's a couple of people in the background, Jonathan Zur from the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, who I had worked with for years and knew beforehand. And I just remember walking out thinking, here's the next step in my story. And while many people were wondering who Governor Northam was going to appoint in this role, and they were looking at me for the first time through fresh eyes, Many people didn't know my story. Many people didn't know the lens upon which I would be approaching this work. And so I'd like to share that with you so that you understand my positionality and so that you understand sort of where I'm coming from. I was introduced professionally to inequity as a educator. I started my career as a special education teacher, but I like to call it, I was teaching students with and without disabilities a love for science, a love for biology and math and just STEM in general. And I understood this idea of, you know, I'm going to change the future and I'm coming in to teach kids how science can be exciting and transformative and informative as we make decisions about our personal lives and our world. And I went in bright-eyed and motivated, as most first-year educators do. And I realized very quickly that I wasn't being treated equitably. And I was placed into a reformed janitor's closet with no window, no sink, no running water to teach kids science, a love of science. And I was being held back from the get-go. So therefore my students were being held back. And it was up to me to figure out how I could provide equitable access to high quality science, because I believed all that I had read, that science was for all. But I quickly learned that that was just a hollow mantra that were in my textbooks. And my professors at the university level would share and recite because it was in the textbook. But when I got into the field, it just wasn't quite the way the textbook said it. And I know as you're sitting there in front of your computers, you're thinking, yeah, that's how it was for me too. Or I learned theoretical knowledge over here, but when I got into the field, I was faced with so many institutional barriers that it seems like everyone doesn't always have to deal with. And I get it. It made me angry. And I thought, what am I going to do about it? And I had to learn to fight. I began to equip my students with the necessary tools to fight against this. And I realized that wasn't enough. I began to equip my parents and families of my students with the necessary tools to fight and confront this inequity and demand an equitable access to their public education. And I was introduced later to this framework called Culturally Relevant Pedagogy by Gloria Ladson-Billings. And I remember thinking, as I looked at the theoretical framework, hey, I'm doing this in real time. I'm applying what these words are. And I finally had the academic or theoretical language to describe the very thing that I'm going through. And I wanted to dig in and I wanted to study that framework more and figure out how to apply it across many different settings. And how do we generalize culturally relevant pedagogy, or this particular framework that was meant to empower learners to solve injustices while demonstrating academic content and academic achievement. And I began to understand this is generalizable across all sectors. And I dug in and I became a trainer of trainers, and I became an educator of educators, what we call teacher educators. And I became a nationally board certified teacher for students with disabilities and exceptionalities, and understand things like twice exceptional and how students who are both gifted and have a disability are even more so discriminated against, and their families are discriminated against because many teachers and other educators don't understand the needs of these students. And so I began to fight and equip others to fight. I began to train teachers, emerging and in-service teachers, how to do the very things that I was doing. I was a trainer for the Virginia Education Association. Shout out to the VEA. I was doing things and moving around the state and the country, making sure that I was preparing math and science educators in transformative ways with social justice teaching frameworks so that students could begin to understand a love of science. That's my equity story. That's what I bring to this work. more than 25 years of rolling up my sleeves and being in the trenches and understanding how to apply cultural frameworks and social justice frameworks to the education sector, because I greatly believe in this idea of we can learn racism and we can learn bigotry and prejudice, but we can also unlearn it. And education is the path by which we do that. So I'm very solid on where I come from. I then became a director of diversity at Old Dominion University, and I viewed myself as more of an equity reformer, a community member, an activist. And oh, by the way, doing all of this, I'm a wife and a mother and a daughter, community member, a member as a faith leader as well, in a house of worship. But I bring that. And I brought that on that day, September 9th, 2019, on the day that Governor Northam announced me. And I said, you know, folks don't know who I am. They don't know, you know, my story. And I need to share it more so that not only do you know who I am, that you begin to figure out who you are and what your equity story is, and bold enough to share it with others. So I'm really excited about that. I also just want to share that we bring our intersectionalities to our work every day. And as you think about your role in serving children around our Commonwealth, which there is no nobler profession, serving our next generations, we've got to understand and reckon with our own biases. So as you begin to form your equity story, as you begin to have the courage and boldness to share your lived experiences that make you who you are, I'm going to ask that you interrogate your biases, your personal biases, and your privileges, because we all have them. Bring them to this work. And I'm going to really challenge you to understand the good and the bad, the high and the lows, because that's what's going to get us through these polarizing times. We have to understand what the problem is. And it's often difficult to do that. Let me just share with you, because sometimes we can't even agree on the problem. Next slide. So what is the problem? What is the problem? The problem, as I see it, as we think about the work that you all are doing, and I mean important work, sometimes we can't understand the differences between equality and equity. Do we want to give children the same supports? Because if we give children the same supports as the picture on the left would suggest, those same supports may not be what everyone needs. And so in the same way, I know many of you have seen this picture over and over and over again. I just want you to look at it with fresh eyes, because as you know, giving people what they need to access something or access success, as you see on the right-hand side, everyone doesn't need the same supports. But I'm going to say we got to go a step further. I still have a problem with this picture, because while our country was founded on the premise of equality and we the people are equal, we know that those promises are hollow, and they didn't include people that look like me and many of the people out in virtual land that look like me as well. So what do we do to get to equality? Because we don't have it. Not yet, anyway. So equity is the road by which we give people what they need so that they can access whatever their dreams are, so that they can access and be in pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. So as you can see, the young person on the right has two boxes so that this person could see over the fence. But I would suggest the fence is still the systemic barrier that keeps these three people from the game. They're still separated from the game, and the institutional or systemic barrier remains. Next slide. So you may have seen this slide as well, where now you have three different people. On the left, you see the same equal boxes. Everyone has the same accommodation, and so everyone must benefit. They're being treated equally. But as you know, as I mentioned, equality is not possible given the fact that we have very unequal systems that were built in Virginia on purpose to be inequitable by the first and second governors, might I add, of Virginia. In the second image, we have equity, where the three individuals that you see are given what they need, and the barrier remains. So on the third image, some people have gotten excited about this image because now they don't need accommodations. They don't need the boxes because they can see directly into the game. But I would suggest the systemic barrier has just been lessened, but still remains. And I question people who would jump up and down about, you know, seeing the wire fence there that prevents the need for the boxes or accommodations. We've seen this in the field when we provide children's services across our state. So certain Band-Aid approaches are applied, but the systemic barriers for these children and their families to really achieve success still remains. And we get frustrated and we say, but we did all this work and we had all these campaigns and we made all these investments, but the systemic barriers are there for our children and families. And what are you going to do about it? Next slide. Another picture that I think many of you have seen. This is just another version of it, where the three individuals are given equal supports, and on the left, and accommodations on the right, so that everyone can access the game. But in the same way, can't get past that fence. They're not in the game. They have no access to the game. They weren't invited into the game. Some people might say, well, maybe they didn't have tickets. I don't care about that. Why are they being separated from the action? So let's dig a little deeper. The problem is the systemic barriers that were placed on purpose. I view that as the fence. What are we going to do about it? What's the right answer? The right answer is to remove the systemic barriers that were put in here on purpose more than 401 years ago. And while the first and second governors of Virginia might have instituted these systemic barriers, and they've been sustained over generations, so that there is unequal access to the game, to the action. I am excited about the direction that Commonwealth is going in now. We are demanding equality, and we're getting there through the equity process, because the 73rd governor said no more, because once I know more, I can do more. And that goes for all of us. Every one of us on the call, we all have fallen short. We all haven't gotten it right, but we have an opportunity. Once we know more, we can do more. Next slide. So this is what I suggest is the answer. Next slide. The first one we learned, the first picture we've learned is that equal accommodations or equal supports don't just make it right. They provide inequitable access. If I gave us all the tasks to run a race and we all were given the same size 7 shoe, would we all be able to fit that shoe? No, it'd be equal, but we all wouldn't be able to fit that shoe. We all wouldn't be able to run the race. So what we learned, next slide, is that we need to give people what they need to access success. But we are all operating with these systemic barriers. And so while equity is going to get us there, the goal, my friends, next slide, is justice. We must begin to labor to remove the systemic barriers. And I don't know what that means in your context, but I know what it means more generally in terms of institutional and structural racism, systemic manifestations of racism. And so for that reason, Governor Northam created the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. He created this position so that I could, along with all of my colleagues like Secretary Kerry and all of the other cabinet members, begin to link arms in transformative ways and really confront systemic injustices. But that doesn't mean that we all don't have our baggage that we bring to the table. That doesn't mean that we all don't have our lived experiences that sometimes stand in the way, but we are united in this idea of we must remove the fence so that there is access to the action, to the success. And in this third picture, justice is seen by the removal of the fence. And that's what we want. That's the ideal. We know that the systems by which we operate in are unequal. They were built that way on purpose. So how do we get rid of them and rebuild them? That's what we need to do. So as we think about the problem, it's difficult for us to all just agree on the problem. Some people say that, structural racism doesn't exist. Some people say that the more you talk about these issues makes you the racist. Well, I'm here to tell you that is so far from the truth. Begin to have these conversations in your departments and divisions and in your local offices, wherever you are, in your school systems. You all come from different backgrounds, and all 1,000 of you who are logged on, you all are in different spheres of influence, but we all create the tapestry of providing supports for children and families. We all can work together to really remove that fence, those systemic barriers to access and success for all children, so that those mantras can once again become, or finally become rather, genuine. Next slide. So we must agree on the problem. And what's the problem? Inequity exists, as the young people say, period. Now, what are we going to do about it? How do we remove those barriers? We can't just hope and wish that people will begin to do the right thing, because in some cases, even the most well-intentioned people say the wrong things, do the wrong things, make mistakes. We all fall short, including myself. We all make mistakes. And let me just tell you, structural racism, systemic institutional racism is so endemic that it is normalized. And sometimes we don't often see it because we are literally so close up to it. So much so that the problem is oftentimes exacerbated, where people begin to tell us, as we fight against that fence in those pictures, the systemic barriers and racism that makes all other forms of oppression possible, those who fight against the removal of that fence, we're told that we hate America. We don't get it. And so we can't oftentimes even agree on the problem. But I'm here to tell you, inequity exists, period. And it's not enough to continue to just have feel-good messages and not do anything about it. So I'm charging everyone on this call, be ready to do something about it. Get fired up and don't let that fire go out. Virginia needs a strategic plan to confront these forms of oppression and to really advance visible equity, visible inclusion, visible diversity where we have none or we have very little. What are we going to do about it? It's not enough to just be hoping and wishing and praying and thinking. We got to do something about it, because we've been hoping and wishing and thinking and praying for many years, and we're not really moving the needle. It's not enough to hope oppression away. We got to have a strategic plan to confront it. We've got to have a coordinated set of activities to confront it. And we all need to be singing with one voice, one sound. We all believe that all children can be successful. We believe and we say that all children deserve a quality education and deserve a safe place to live, work, and play and learn. And we see right now that that is ever so on all of our minds, given the inequitable access to online learning and a safe home and food insecurity and all the other things that are become so incredibly visible to us. What are we going to do about it? I often say you can't change what you don't measure, and you can't measure that which you don't acknowledge. And these issues are so endemic, it's hard to just put your finger on it, right? Because you know that we're not dealing with Jim Crow anymore. We're dealing with more like James Crow Esquire, a little more cunning, a little more insidious. You can't quite understand the legal ramifications of some of this de facto racism, de facto prejudice and discrimination, which seems to be insulated by the legal system and allowed and perpetuated in awful ways that when you sit at your desk and you know this just isn't right. Is anyone watching? Is anyone looking? I'm over here struggling. I feel like I'm working by myself. I get it. It's time to break out of those silos and begin to make visible that on purpose the inequities so that we can actually create a plan to confront it. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the governor created this office to really think about these issues across all the secretariats. The governor has given me a unique set of a unique charge, a unique set of authority that allows me to evaluate leaders, legislation, and logistics. I'm a teacher, so I love an alliteration, right? So as we think about our leadership at every level, at every agency, across our cabinet, right? As we think about legislation that has already passed and legislation that will pass, let's look at it through an equity lens to ensure that we are not creating additional systemic barriers or fences to access and success. And then how do we remove those barriers to success that have been placed there on purpose? And then logistics, as we think about funding formulas and SWAM procurement numbers and completion rates for students in higher ed at our public colleges and universities, and making sure everyone feels welcomed in our state. So we have created a statewide strategic plan for diversity and inclusive excellence. And in doing so, one of the very first things that we thought was important was that this work not go away. Secretary Kerry mentioned early on that you all have a strategic plan to really move your work forward in transformative ways. And so he doesn't want that plan to sit on the shelf, right, and just collect dust, and neither do we. So as we think about this statewide strategic plan for all state agencies that link literally every agency's strategic plan to build diversity, equity, and inclusion in a visible way, we knew that we didn't want this work to just go away when the Northam administration goes away. And we only have 14 short months. So I'm so happy to share with you that House Bill 394 codified this cabinet level position for every future governor's administration. So whomever the governor is in Virginia, who's next, Governor 74 will have to appoint a chief diversity officer in his or her cabinet. And that's incredible because that's how you build systemic justice, to fight against systemic injustice. Let's talk a little bit about the statewide strategic plan on a very high level. Next slide. As we begin to think about how do we confront these issues in transformative ways, I will share with you that the statewide strategic plan did take a detour because of a little thing called coronavirus, but that didn't stop us. It just changed how we began to operationalize equity across the state. And I really call it equity in action, not just equity in a textbook, not just equity from a theoretical model, because everyone, and you may know this, likes to say equity, or building and working with an equity lens. Equity, equity, equity. People throw that word around like they get money from it every time they say it, which absolutely infuriates me, because many times folks don't know what they're talking about and they just want to say it to sound good. They want to say it like in a sound bite. But what is equity and what does it look like in action? Well, I can share with you, under my leadership, the Health Equity Leadership Task Force was created so that we could see visible equity in our COVID-19 response and recovery. The Unified Command now has a health equity working group because of the leadership of Governor Northam. As the only governor doctor, he said, you know, as we go through this particular health emergency, back in March, he said, I know that diverse communities, communities of color, and low-income communities in both urban and rural areas are going to suffer most in this pandemic. And so he wanted to make sure that the entire response was really guided by equity in robust ways. And he created, in addition to the state health commissioner that's standing there, Dr. Norm Oliver, they created the Health Equity Working Group to really guide that work. And it's been truly the honor of my life to do that. And what we've done, actually, next slide, is help local governments turn their work towards health equity. And we have partnered with 71 local governments to say, how can you turn your local unified command towards health equity and pinpoint those people in your local area who need the most help? We don't need to give everyone the same size box, right? But we need to give people what they need to survive and thrive during this pandemic. So we've used very, very up-to-date data and robust data to pinpoint those neighborhoods across the Commonwealth in these 71 local government areas or municipalities. And we have pinpointed public health information, provided 20,000 masks and 20,000 bottles of hand sanitizer, and in some cases even more, to the local governments, created plans to help certain neighborhoods get access to health information and health insurance, and help students who didn't early on in the pandemic have a laptop, connect them with some of our communication partners to receive a laptop and Wi-Fi hotspots. We help those local governments take the lead in providing their residents who needed the help they needed. Again, really operationalizing what equity looked like. So there you see the governor and I in the city of Richmond, one of our very first local government pilot programs where we literally worked with the local government, worked with faith leaders, very diverse faith leaders and legislators, and put bags together. And we literally went door to door to hand out some of these supplies to those who needed it most. That's what I call equity in action. So the Virginia Equity Task Force really is an innovative mechanism that allowed other states to replicate what we were doing. And we meet with other states and we are doing the work collaboratively across the nation, really to say, you know, we hear on the news everyone talking about the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color and low-income communities. And people are talking about it, they're not really saying what they're doing about it. But behind the scenes, we are going to all communities across the Commonwealth of Virginia and talking with other states to learn about what other states are doing and share with those other states what we're doing. And what we found is that imitation is the best form of flattery, and so many other states are using the Virginia model of equity in action and really serving communities across our nation. And what an honor it is to really build a culture of allies across the entire nation in building visible equity. So that work is ongoing, and it definitely keeps me awake at night. And we constantly think about what Secretary Kerry says about that self-care, so we can make sure that we are being able to come fully present and help and do all the things that we're asked to do. But This is a lot of comprehensive work, and I can't do it alone. I have to give a special shout out to the equity leadership team, Director Curtin of the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. Under his leadership, Dr. Lauren Powell is our equity consultant in VDEM. We also have Sable K. Nelson Dyer, who is the director or acting director of the Office of Health Equity at the Virginia Department of Health. We have Alacia Hackett at the Virginia Department of Human Resource Management, and so many others in supporting roles, such as Michaela Swan, who's with us today in the governor's office, to really operationalize what health equity means to the Commonwealth and be a leader in this space. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about what the problem is, and I said that we need a strategic plan, but what's the goal of that strategic plan? What's the mission? I suggest that we are many Virginians, but we are one Commonwealth strong. So the shared goal of my office is to develop Virginia into an inclusive state where all people can live, learn, work, play, and thrive. And I think that's so incredible, because as we think about all the residents of Virginia, that's all we want. We want to live, we want to learn, we want to work, we want to play, and we want to thrive. And is that so much to ask? Some people would suggest that everyone isn't deserving of that. But I stand here to say I'm willing to link arms with all of you and fight for this mission, what I call a One Virginia mission. Next slide. So the 5 goals of the One Virginia plan are here on the screen. I won't go over all of them, but I will direct you to the website, and Michaela will put it in the chat, and you can learn a little bit more about the One Virginia mission. I'm really working with my colleagues in the cabinet, in particular, a special shout out to Secretary Kiana Connor, Secretary of Administration, and her team at the Department of Human Resource Management, who is really collaborating with me to create this One Virginia plan to really build sustainable diversity, equity, and inclusion, visible equity across our state agencies and institutions of higher ed. We know we have systemic issues across all of our agencies, because these agencies were built upon systems that were built inequitably in the first place. So what are we going to do about it? And I suggest the One Virginia plan, because as I mentioned, there's more that unites us than divides us. And I don't think any one of these 5 goals is too much to ask. And I'm going to ask you to, wherever you are, put up your hand, give me a virtual high five, right? Typically, we are born with 5 fingers on our hand. Typically, I know that there are some exceptions to that, but typically 5 fingers on our hand. And I suggest only 5 goals in the One Virginia plan. If you have more than 5, you're doing too much and you can't hold it in one hand. Let's just do 5 things. If we can just do 5 things really well, we can begin to measure that which has been nebulous for so long. We can begin to measure and address those structural and systemic issues that we haven't been able to really put our finger on. If we do more than 5 things, it's too much. People don't know where to get started and therefore become complacent, frustrated, and then they give up. Well, I'm here to serve as backbone support as part of the collective impact framework, which I know many of you know about. But the collective impact framework or model suggests that we can do so much more strategically if we break out of our silos and really link arms together. Not hold hands, because I know we can't do that in coronavirus land. But if we link elbows together and say, listen, I need you and you need me. How can we build sustainable and visible equity so that we can get to equality, so that we all can live, learn, play, work, thrive together? So these 5 goals and an entire online kit will be available to you, every one of you, at my website. I'm hoping no later than November 30th. I'm hoping. Please consider bringing the One Virginia plan to your local agency, your school district, wherever your sphere of influence is, because I know that we can do so much more when we break out of our silos and we build collective impact. And you may already have a strategic plan in your organization, but this is something you can begin to build upon your current strategic plan, or it can inform your strategic planning process going forward. And I promise you, instead of paying a consultant $50,000 to $100,000 to create a strategic plan, I have done the work for you. And there will be online templates. There will be worksheets to create SMART goals. There will be tons and tons of educational resources available to you for free, hopefully by November 30th. So I really challenge you, if you want to do something about that fence and all of those systemic barriers, consider the One Virginia plan in your sphere of influence so that we can build collective impact unlike we have ever before. Next slide. So I want to ask you, where is your organization fall on this continuum? There are 1,000 of you out there, and I know that you all have a thread of serving children and family that binds us all together, all 1,000 of us. Somehow you impact children, families, children and family services. You do something that helps children. You're an educator, you're a behavior specialist or an analyst, you are social services, you are so many things. Wherever you are, wherever you sit, whatever organization you provide leadership to, where do you fall on this continuum? Honestly, think about it. Most of you, I guarantee you, fall under compliance, because that's the EEOC mentality of keeping us out of trouble, right? This is the let's follow the law. But the law in many cases has been built inequitably. So let's think about moving towards inclusive excellence on the far end of this continuum. And what inclusive excellence means to your agency, according to the One Virginia plan, you get to individualize the One Virginia plan for your sphere of influence. You all get to operationalize what inclusive excellence means to you in your sphere, your agency, your organization. And we provide just a menu of choices from which to choose and measure that which has been previously unmeasurable. So just consider that. And there will be tons of resources on November 30th that will help you really assess your organization. Next slide. I want to start to draw to a close. I want you to know I'm voting. And so many people have voted earlier. We have had over 2.5 million people vote early in Virginia as of today. But I'm voting. And my plan, because everyone says make a plan to vote, my plan is to vote on Election Day. And the reason why that's my plan is because I am so excited that Election Day is now a state holiday. Governor Northam, with the help of an amazing set of legislators, passed legislation. It was signed on July 1 that we would remove one particular holiday that was no longer commensurate with who we are in Virginia, Lee Jackson Day, in favor of making democracy more accessible to all. And that's what I mean by removing the barriers, the fence. So in celebration of now Election Day being a state holiday, I plan to vote, and I hope you are too. Now, if you do vote in person, even if it's early, be safe, wear a mask, use social distancing, and above all, if you have any questions or trouble voting, please don't hesitate to contact the Virginia State Board of Elections. But let me also say that your local registrar is the best place to start if you have any problems. The other thing I'll just mention I can't tell you who to vote for, but I can tell you to consider voting for those candidates that will champion these issues of equity. If you're really serious about equity and you're serious about visible DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, consider voting for elected officials all across Virginia and even in this nation that champion these issues in genuine ways. Now, in addition to voting, there's so many other ways that you can get involved. And I want to share those with you very quickly. And Michaela's going to put some links in the chat for you. So be ready to capture them, copy and paste them, and transfer them to a Word document, if you will. Now, listen up, get ready, because I have some tangible ways for you to get started today. In addition to voting, I really challenge you to do 3 things. Sign up for the governor's press releases. And you can go to the governor's website and go to the press room, the virtual press room, and you can submit to get email updates where you are very much in the know every time the governor and the administration announce some major initiative. That's how information is key. That's how you stay in the know so that you can send those messages and that information to your communities you serve. The second thing I ask you to consider doing is to consider submitting an application for a state board or commission if you haven't done so already. I surmise that there are many of you out there that may already serve on one of the governor's boards or commissions, but these are appointed volunteer positions that you can apply for today. Please go and please consider going to the website for the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office and view the remaining positions that are available. We need people just like you that are committed to equity and visible equity so that your voices can be heard in the service of the Commonwealth. Now, there'll be a link in the chat for you to apply for those boards and commissions, or at the very least, consider looking at what is open. And then the third thing I'm going to ask you to do is attend a public meeting of one of these boards or commissions. And now that COVID-19 has forced all of us to do things virtually, you can attend a public meeting virtually and not have to worry about driving to Richmond and finding a parking space and walking to get to the meeting. You can attend a public advisory board or commission meeting. You can also request to speak during the public comment and have your voice heard. Listen to the conversations that are being had. That's how you get in the game. That's how you build systemic justice and equity. So please do consider one of those 3 things of getting involved right away. And remember, in addition to all of those, please consider voting and allowing your voice to be heard. If you have a problem at the polling, at any of your polling places, don't hesitate to call the Virginia Department of Elections. Also, campaigns and state political parties operate their own voter protection programs, and a voter may choose to contact one of those supports if you have a problem with voting. And you can call, if you're ready, if you have a pen, please consider calling 844-4VA-VOTE, 844-4VA-VOTE if you have a problem at your polling place. Next slide. In closing, I'll just say, it's been the honor of my career to serve as the nation's first Chief Diversity Officer. I often talk about these conversations as being diversity wins. I call these conversations that we've been having today Commonwealth conversations. We are setting the stage for the nation who needs Virginia even more to be a national exemplar so that we can really get to a place where we have reconciliation and we lead with visible equity and just plain old respect and kindness. Those are the most important diversity wins, in my opinion. And so as I close and we open it up for questions, my website is here. I know it's in the chat. don't hesitate to reach out to me early and often. It's been an honor to be with you, and it's been an honor to serve in this inaugural way. We are leading the way in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I couldn't be more proud to do it with you. Thank you so much. Zandra?
Thank you, Dr. Underwood. On behalf of the Office of Children's Services, and thank you, Secretary Terry. That was an outstanding presentation, and you really gave us some tools and information that can help wherever we are on our diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. So we do have a few questions that came in through the chat. So I'd like to go ahead and begin to pose those to you. First of all, you mentioned and spoke about structural racism. And we had a couple of questions about what that actually looks like that fence. What are some examples of what that fence looks like in reality?
Yeah,
like
sure.
in our community.
Sure. This looks like, and I'll put it in the context of sort of education, because that's my, that's my realm. That's my expertise. It looks like inequitable funding for schools. This is an example, and you see that fence when you see schools in highly urban areas because of redlining and the way we fund schools. You saw in the 1950s, let me just go back. Let's talk about, write this down, Homestead Act. Write it down, Google it, Homestead Act. You saw it, and I'm gonna go all the way back. You saw it when the explorers and settlers were coming over. They were given a certain amount of money, a ship, a crew. If you're willing to go to the United States of America, it wasn't the United States of America then, go and settle the land. We'll give you so much money to get started. Well, that began to build wealth for Europeans who came over here. But now when we think about giving people anything, if they're people of color, it's now viewed as a handout. People of color weren't given the opportunity to come to this nation free and or equipped with, at the time, the equivalent of, millions of dollars to just start living, right, and tending the land. And so as we think about even in the 1950s, this idea of redlining and creating communities where they were segregated so that the schools would be segregated. There was white flight when Black families began to move into these communities. And then when property values went down, the schools in those areas were underfunded. We also saw, despite the 1964 ruling of the Civil Rights Act, and we began to see Brown versus the Board of Education outlawed, separate is inherently outlawed segregation and said separation is inherently unequal. You also began to see massive resistance in Virginia. There were some people that just said, no, I am not sending my children to school with Black children as a white family. And I'm not going to send my white children to a Black school with Black teachers who have the ability at the time for corporal punishment. That Black teacher is not going to hit my white child. So they pulled their kids out of school, and a whole generation of Virginians were uneducated or undereducated. We see those effects today. We see literally school segregation today. Our schools are more segregated today than they were in the 1960s and 70s. That's incredible. Look at our governor's schools, for example. Maggie Walker and Thomas Jefferson High School, the #1 high schools almost in the nation. People are fighting against having them integrated, so to speak, or even allowing diversity, or even suggesting that if you allow more diverse students as candidates, somehow you are devaluing the education at these premier high schools that are very much mostly white, right? So we've got to think about the antecedents, the historical antecedents that go way beyond when we were there. And many people say, Sandra, well, I wasn't there. I didn't lynch anyone. Neither have I. Or they'll say things like, I wasn't there when they created this policy or this, that, right? But this is what I'm going to challenge everyone here with. You might not have been there and you might not have done this or that, but what are you doing about it now that we know that these things are inequitable? How are you fighting against those inequitable policies, or even if they're informal practices in your agencies that allow white supremacy to be endemic or ran rampant? What microaggressions are you perpetuating and you don't even know? Someone said to me something so incredibly offensive in an online chat at work, and they didn't even know that it was offensive. They thought they were complimenting me. This was yesterday. And these are people who swear they get it. We've got to interrogate our own personal biases and our own positionality and power so that we can begin to really transformatively fight against those fences. And can I also say, you might not have been there when Thomas Jefferson really instituted, these systemic injustices in our systems, right? Second governor of Virginia, but the 73rd governor of Virginia appointed me to help break those down. So even as I stand on the steps that were built by enslaved laborers of the Capitol, right? Or I go to UVA and I stand on those steps of the architecture that he famously built, really was built by enslaved laborers. I'm fighting against these inequities as well with each and every one of you. And we weren't there when those things happened, but we certainly weren't there when the Constitution was written and it made all these other fake promises to all of us. But we certainly want to enjoy those promises also. So if we want to enjoy the promises that are the good promises, we've got to fight against those things that were meant to oppress some people. Because if it's really we the people, that includes you and me and Scott and Secretary Kerry and that fourth grader who's struggling online right now to access a quality education, who's struggling with a disability and really wants to be in that geometry class, but they're being held back because they don't believe or their counselor doesn't believe that they're smart enough to go to college, so they don't need to really be in geometry. So put them in consumer math anyway. That's the fence.
Dr. Underwood, that's excellent. Thank you for that very practical approach. Sometimes, as you said, people don't believe that there's an issue. What type of, you mentioned data, what type of data can people look for that's not the obvious? Supposedly, that's not direct, but that they have access to that might help them tease out where they should begin with their DEI efforts?
Well, that's a great question, because that really goes into this idea of assessment. We all have to do our individual assessments and ongoing reflection, but organizational assessments. Some of the more macro data sets could be US Census Tract data, and really looking at census tract data over time and trends, funding formulas. Our standards of quality have been underfunded. And I know I'm saying things that just the mention of standards of quality, that their lack of funding across our educational institutions, K-12 or pre-K through 12, have been wholly lacking. And I join you in calling for equitable funding to bring us up to where we need to be. those are just some areas. And again,
Okay.
I really ask all of the viewers to start sitting in some of these boards and commissions and begin to get access to some of these data sets that you didn't even realize maybe even existed. Start letting your voice be heard, and building collective impact means coming out of your sphere of influence and just having a conversation with someone in a different one.
That's fantastic. Well, Dr. Underwood, I know that I appreciate, and on behalf of our executive director, Scott Reiner, and everyone, and all in the audience, I'd like to say thank you for sharing your wonderful message, your charge, actually be change agents, and thank you for your time and your wisdom. It's been incredible, and I know you have another engagement, so I don't want to delay you. And on behalf of everyone here, thank you.
Thank you.
To our audience, this now brings us to the conclusion of the first part of our day. I just would like to remind you that we will promptly begin our next session at 10:15, and we will have a short break. So join us then and enjoy your next few minutes. Thank you.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to grab a cup of coffee. And I got to tell you, I'm ready to jump out of my office and go start doing something about equity after listening to Dr. Underwood. What an awesome way to get us started. And but I wouldn't want to jump out quite yet. I may wait till after lunch because we have a couple of great speakers coming your way for the rest of the morning. But let me just, before I introduce them, tell you about a little excitement that we are going to have here at the end of the morning, both today and tomorrow. We have some prizes, giveaways, to offer you guys who are joining us. And this morning, there'll be a set of different things from our friends at the Norfolk Visitors Bureau, where we were hoping to be. And so Zandra will be announcing the winners of those prizes. But, you know, we always say you have to be in the room to win. So we don't know who's out there on YouTube. So the way we're going to do this is as follows. In a minute, I'm going to give you the secret word. And if you hear the secret word, we'll know you are in the room. And if your name gets called by Zandra at the end of, so we're going to stop at noon, between noon and 2 o'clock, if you send an email, which includes the secret word in the email, to Elaine Densley, which is E. Densley, E-D-E-N-S-L-E-Y, at vt.edu. And someone will put that in the chat for us and for you. If you send an email with the word equity, we will get your winnings to you. If we don't hear from you, we have a backup list and we'll get in touch with them. And don't forget the word equity, even if we don't call your name, because you may be next on the list. So we're happy to do that. Tomorrow we'll be doing something similar. And at the end of the day tomorrow, we'll be giving away 2 complimentary registrations to next year's conference, should we be able to hold it in person. So the word for today is equity. And like I said, Dr. Underwood has really, and every time I listen to her or speak with her, she really lights a fire under us to move ourselves personally, our agencies, and our communities in the direction of equity and inclusion. So with that said, we do have a great presentation for you coming up next around issues of how the pandemic has had an impact on education, what lessons both public schools, especially in the area of special education, as well as our partners in the private special education schools have learned, what adaptations they've been able to make, and which of those things will carry forward even after the pandemic is hopefully in our rearview mirror. So with us this morning are really just two of my favorite partners in the world of education and just in general. Angie Neely is with us, and Angie is the Executive Director of Special Education for the Culpeper County Public Schools. And in that role, she heads up all of the special education activities for students with disabilities in Culpeper County. And she's been doing this about as long as I've been doing this stuff. Started her teaching career in Fairfax County 32 years ago, and has since had a number of roles and has been the executive director in Culpeper for the last 17 years. In addition, she's the past president of the Virginia Council of Administrators of Special Education, or VCASE, which is the statewide organization of all of the special education directors in the 130 some odd school divisions across the Commonwealth. And in addition, Angie has been a longtime member of the state and local advisory team for CSA. And whenever I want to talk about public schools and special education and trying to understand the unique challenges that they face, Angie's my go-to person. Joining Angie today is a really excellent partner from the world of private special education. Wade Purtier is the Vice President of Education for United Methodist Family Services Charterhouse School, which in addition to their school that they operate here in Richmond, also operate a unique, I think, and really innovative public-private partnership to address the needs of special education students in Edinburgh, which if you don't know where that is, that's in the Shenandoah Valley. And is it Page County? Just nod Wade if is it Page or one of those?
Shenandoah County.
Shenandoah County. Well, yeah. So they run a really interesting partnership with a number of the public school divisions in that area. And Wade has been with UMFS for quite a while. And as Angie is my kind of go-to on public school special education issues, when questions about how we interact at CSA with private schools, Wade is often one of the first people I want to talk to. So we're pleased and privileged to have them with us here today. And at this point, I will turn it over to Angie and Wade and say once again, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I don't think I've ever attended a conference with almost 1,000 participants. So Scott, as you said earlier this morning, that's a little intimidating. But thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. Wade and I have had a really enjoyable time putting this presentation together, and realized how much we had in common with public schools and private schools in this experience of COVID. So it's been a lot of fun to put this together and get to know Wade in the process. I've really enjoyed the comments from Dr. Underwood this morning. The challenge to work towards equity is just such an important challenge, and I've really appreciated hearing from her. As she was relaying her first year actually as a special ed teacher, my ears pricked up because I too started teaching in a closet 32 years ago in Fairfax County. It was an interesting experience, and I'm so thankful that we usually that doesn't happen anymore in schools and special ed. I hope it's not happening anywhere in any of your school districts in Virginia. So we have some information to share with you today. Wade, would you, do you want to say anything before we talk about the agenda? Whoops. There we go.
So yeah, this is totally fun. I'm sharing my slides and trying to unmute and stuff, and this is the world we're in right now, right? With our meetings and with everything we're doing, and then as Angie and I will talk about today, with special education and education in general. So yeah, I thank Scott and CSA for asking us to do this. It's been a lot of fun working with Angie and just the connections, and we'll talk more later, that we've been able to make between the private and the public schools. And we're all dealing with the same challenge. You know, we keep hearing we're all in this together. Well, we really are. And I think Angie and I, as we built this and talked, realized all the common challenges and common opportunities that we'll talk about that we've discovered along the way. So, you know, always we've learned a lot about flexibility and the like. So very excited to be here and share a little bit of that with you all today.
So here's our agenda for the day. And in summary, I think what we want to do is just peel back that curtain a little bit and let you take a look behind the scenes in what special education looks like during a pandemic. I think it's been an interesting journey, and I think Wade would agree that maybe roller coaster ride is a more accurate description of this journey that we've been on.
So Angie found this great quote here that we'd like to share to start off, and by Johnny Corn. We have a chance to do something extraordinary. As we head out of this pandemic, we can change the world, create a world of love, a world where we are kind to each other, a world where we are kind no matter what class, race, sexual orientation, what religion or lack of, or what job we have, a world we don't judge those at the food bank, because that may be us if things were just slightly different. Let love and kindness be our roadmap. And, you know, that kind of connects back to, I believe, some of the stuff Dr. Underwood was talking about this morning. You know, we've discovered that we're facing this common challenge together. And, you know, many times working with our families, working with our staff and teachers, and each other, we have to practice a lot of grace and flexibility and understanding, you know, more than ever before. You know, we're already in this world. And, you know, personally this morning, I'd planned to be doing this from some other location, but I got the message that my own children, who've started going to school 2 days a week now in a hybrid model, they're actually releasing early because of the storm coming. So that changed my plans, and we're having to be that adaptable. And the word pivot has become a big deal around education. And it's true, we have to almost move at a moment's notice, and understanding that no matter what circumstances we're facing, and that we could all be looking at dire circumstances or challenges that we've not seen before. So just that understanding and coming out of this in a spirit of grace and flexibility and understanding.
So a little bit of background, and most of you are probably familiar with this. If you have children in schools, or you have someone in your household who's a teacher or works in schools, I don't know about you, but I've started to think in terms of BC and AC before COVID and after COVID. And Scott talked this morning about BCE, before COVID era. So, you know, when we were into February and March and things were heating up, as the school division here in Culpeper, we had started to talk about some backup plans. I don't know that I personally ever thought that schools would actually close, and I certainly never anticipated that schools would close for the remainder of the school year. But on March 13th, by executive order from Governor Northam, schools were closed for 2 weeks. And then subsequently on March 30th, schools were closed for the rest of the school year. In Culpeper and in most divisions, we did have a backup plan in place. Ironically, though, we were going to pass out Chromebooks for our elementary students on Monday, the 16th of March. And of course, we missed that. March 13th was a teacher work day for us. So our teachers were already spending the day putting together plans and packets of instruction to send home for our students in the event that schools would be closed temporarily. All of our middle and high school students already had an individual Chromebook, so they were set to go. But our elementary students were left without their Chromebooks. So they were relying on those in those first 2 weeks, and then for the rest of the school year, really on work packets that teachers were sending home. Most public schools in Virginia, at least here in my region of the state and in my contacts with my colleagues across the state, provided what we call a continuity of learning. We didn't continue with new instruction except in cases of dual enrollment courses or advanced placement classes. So most of our instruction was a review. It was a supplement to what had already been learned. Many school divisions, instead of doing IEP addendums, created what we call temporary learning plans. And we did this for many reasons. I personally had a very difficult time in my head conceptualizing the idea of doing an IEP amendment when I knew that in this era of schools being shut down, we couldn't deliver what students needed. And that's what an IEP is. It reflects what a student needs in order to progress in the curriculum. We couldn't do that because we were caught unprepared. We weren't providing new instruction. We had kids that didn't have the internet, that didn't have access to Chromebooks. So we created a temporary learning plan for all of our students that provided that continuity of learning for the remainder of the school year.
And in the private school world, you know, I never forget the day it happened. You know, we were sort of pulling together as well last minute. The schools were going to close March 16th, and we actually made that a work day. And I feel like, you know, I've reached out to and done surveys with our colleagues of BASEF accredited schools around the state, and everyone had a very similar experience of, we knew we had to do what was right for kids. And you know, I have in here the private schools continue to go forward with providing services with no guarantee of the payment structure, because we'd never dealt with this before. And I'm really happy to say that, you know, the local CSAs and Scott and the state and our public school partners, we really worked and collaborated together on what this meant for our private students. It wasn't always easy, as things are, but I'm really proud of the work that occurred and went on there. With the private schools and the public partners working together to collaborate on what this meant. You know, many private schools, you know, did not have a one-to-one Chromebook type of a technology integration going on, and we worked to do that. You know, some did, some didn't, but we worked to create those packets that Angie talked about, and how do we get them out to our students? We worked to get the technology in the hands of the kids who may have not already had it at home, so they can continue to access. And then, you know, with our school, as Scott was mentioning, up in the Shenandoah Valley, you know, we have a lot of kids there who had no internet access. And, you know, we worked on how do we create the paper packets for them and get them out to them and get them returned. And how do we, even in the midst of this pandemic, continue to check on those kids and families? Because, you know, as a private therapeutic day school, one of the biggest things we provide is that treatment focus, that therapeutic and behavioral support focus, because these kids haven't been successful in the traditional public school. And we did a lot of that virtually with our therapists and our behavior support coaches, checking in with families and doing groups and individual therapy online. But then we had some kids who didn't have that access. And there were a few who would actually go out to the porches of certain houses and do check-ins there with socially distanced from the sidewalk or from the driveway. But so there were a lot of challenges, and it was great to have the support of everyone in that as we moved forward. And you know, with residential treatment facilities, schools within those facilities remained open as an essential service during this time, which was different. So even before, when we'll get to in a minute about the health mitigation plans and things that had to be created, at that first onset, we didn't have those. So we had to figure it out based on collaboration with the health department and looking at the data from CDC. So residential treatment facilities and schools within those kept moving during the entire process. And as I said, schools were unprepared. Nothing like this has ever happened in recent history. And we have lots of plans in place, but a plan for 100% remote or virtual learning hasn't been one of those. And teacher prep programs don't include training on how to do that. So our teachers really, who had never had that experience, were learning something brand new, really at a moment's notice. And the fact, and especially at Charterhouse, we talk a lot about belonging being an essential human growth need for everyone. And we know that good teaching is all about relationships, all about those connections. And how do you do those virtually? How do you do that when you're not right there in the classroom? And we had new kids join us throughout this time, and really thinking and working on how do we do that. And I know that happened in public schools as well, both public and private. How do we make this relationship with the student and the parent without seeing them in person? So really, we all recreated special education from March to June of 2020. And I think that learning led to some of the successes we've had this fall.
And by the way, there was no relaxing of the IDEA requirements for schools. And for those of you who aren't familiar with IDEA, it's the federal law for special education, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And one of the expressions that I've heard 1,000 times in the past several months, and I've probably said just as many times, is that IDEA was not built for a pandemic. There's no provision in the law for what happens if schools close down. And there was no relaxing of those requirements from the U.S. Department of Education or the Secretary of Education. We kept waiting, we kept hoping, and there was no relaxing of the requirements occurred. So that caused a lot of stress for special education directors, and I'm sure for Wade and his colleagues as well, because we really had to figure out how to deal with this, or we were going to be majorly in non-compliance. And in special education, there are indicators that we report on every year, and there are consequences and ramifications for being out of compliance, and that's nothing to not take seriously. So we had to figure out what to do about our timelines for evaluations. When schools closed in March, we had a lot of evaluations that were midway through the process. We had some we hadn't started yet, and we have 65 days to do those. And in the beginning, we thought, well, surely schools will open up before the end of the school year and we'll be able to catch up on these evaluations. And as we know now, that didn't happen. So the timelines for annual IEPs stayed in effect. So teachers working from home, sometimes not having good internet from home, had to figure out a way to hold an IEP meeting from home and get that notice out to parents and take care of all of those requirements for annual IEPs. We also had to adhere to IEPs that were already in place. And obviously we couldn't do that. And our best attempt was to put in place that temporary learning plan that at least provided for some services for students. It was difficult. We made it work. In the world of special education today, there are many school divisions that are having legal challenges due to the closing of school. But I think for the most part, parents have been understanding of the challenges that we all had during that time.
And Angie, I'll just add, this piece of adherence to IEPs and the services that are outlined in those. I mean, UMFS, that one of our core values is collaboration multiplies impact. And man, collaboration was the real key in that, because you have kids with services outlined in the IEP. And just because we're virtual, as you said, there was no easing up on that requirement. So how do we continue to provide individual counseling once per week as outlined in the IEP, individualized behavior support, speech and language services, when we weren't sure what was going to happen. And it took collaboration between the public school, the private school, the public school, and the parents and any other providers to really make that work. And it was, in the end, you're right, we made it work, and it was pretty amazing to see.
And I think that's a great point, Wade, because even though schools closed physically, the doors were closed, school did not close. Teachers were still doing reading sessions every day and teaching math and teaching social emotional skills and working on communication. Speech therapists were still doing therapy with kids. If they couldn't do it by video, they were doing it by telephone. So school continued during that time for sure, even though the doors were closed. So we waited in great anticipation to learn from the governor's office and the Virginia Department of Education what was going to happen next. And on June 9th, Governor Northam announced the plan for the reopening of schools. And this graphic that you're looking at is the cover of what we call the Big Book. It's 120 pages that outline the phased reopening of schools. And in summary, in the book, it basically outlined a plan for phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, very similar to how Virginia has opened up as a state. It was clear that new instruction would be the expectation. This wasn't going to be a continuation of learning that we had in the spring. This was a time for new instruction with the standards of learning. Some instruction would be in person, some would be remote. I think in the book at some point it really talked about how all students would have some form of remote learning in order to meet the CDC guidelines, make sure that students were spaced. I put in there 3 to 6 feet. I think most people have gone with a six foot space between students and staff members. And that included on buses. Buses could only have 1 student per seat, every other seat, unless you had siblings that you were riding with or maybe a close family friend. So this book outlined all of the requirements for starting school. It also prioritized the needs of our most vulnerable students. So students in special education, students who are English learners, English language learners, preschool children, young elementary school children, those children were prioritized. And it also prioritized social emotional learning. We knew that schools being closed down was very detrimental for a lot of students and families. Dr. Underwood talked about those vulnerable families in her talk earlier. And we were worried about those kids because teachers are usually the first line of defense to, see whether kids are being cared for, if there are symptoms of abuse and neglect going on at home. They often listen to children and help them through and connect them with school counselors and social workers. So there was a lot of concern about kind of the emotional and mental health being of kids as they return to school. So as I said, there were 3 phases of school reopening. The first one was something that started immediately in June, and that was making way for special education students to come to school, and including private placements if the IEP team agreed and the parents consented. It also allowed us to start evaluating students because we were backed up on our evaluations. Phase 2 was preschool through grade 3, and that included special education, and that is when we started our extended school year program. Some divisions actually had in-person. We did not here in Culpeper. We were a very Culpeper had a very high COVID rate back in the spring. At one point, I think we were number 3 per capita for the state. And fortunately, things have really evened out now and our metrics look good. But going into the summer, we did not feel comfortable bringing students in for school. So we did not do any of this in phase 2 except for evaluating students. And then phase 3 was the shift to in-person instruction with CDC guidelines in place. And Wade, I think that's on our next slide for you to talk about.
Yeah, so in that big red book, which was 120 pages of a lot of work. I was gonna joke and say thrilling reading, but not really. But a lot of work went into that, and especially as you take that red book, and you'll see in a little bit, take that red book and translate it into what does that look like for a public school with special education or a private special education school. It was a lot. And so really those reopening guidelines, focused on health and safety, all those mitigation plans. And someone on our executive team talks about layers of mitigation. How many layers can we put in place? And, with 3 to 6 feet in the classrooms, there was also things about how do you measure that 6 feet? Is it 144 square? Or is it 6 feet between desks? And can we put up guards and things like that? So lots of questions, and no one, people typically had to find the answer. So, but there was a focus there on health and safety, a focus on social emotional learning, because, school is that place of belonging for so many kids. School is where, like Angie said, the students get their access to a counselor, access to mental health and wellness. And so how do we keep that going while we're virtual? And then how do we increase that as our students come back to us, that many have been at home and many times in environments that were way less than ideal. And how do we help bridge that and bring that up? Focusing on data collection and measurable goals and progress using our monitoring systems, because in the virtual world, that has been a challenge. And then coming back, how do we collect that data and then look at remediation? Because we know that students, as they have been out, will possibly have regressed if they were in a continuity of learning and not learning new material. Some who didn't engage in the virtual platforms, how do we check where they are, and then assess that and then make plans to fill in the gaps for those skills. So those vulnerable students, as we say, were prioritized in the reopening plan, so that would be the first, and that's been across the state. Our private special education schools, many went first with summer programs, and then coming back in the fall, either in person or hybrid or staggered approaches. Many public schools started there with their students with more intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then the younger students are those receiving lots of supports and needing that targeted attention. And then that kind of flows throughout all 3 phases. And then, of course, additional resources have been provided for the special education groups. So what does reopening of schools look like? Well, each school district back over the summer had to take that red book and submit their own plans for health mitigation. Public schools submitted them to the Virginia Department of Education. Private schools submitted them to VCPE, which is the Virginia Council for Private Education. That was private schools all across the state, special ed, licensed, unlicensed, didn't matter. We submitted those plans to VCPE. And, they had to include interesting things like, how would we mitigate through the phases? How would we look at what our phases are? How would we coordinate and collaborate with the health department, the local health departments? And then, we had to do, many schools like us had to do things where we had to submit variances to the plan. So for example, if we are reopening in person and we work with kids with high behavioral needs that may become safety issues, or kids that need physical contact because of things like the toileting and such. How do we do that? Because that's going to break the plan. We can't stay 6 feet away or even 3 feet with masks and protectors and do that work. So we had to talk about how would we vary from that plan and really keep our kids safe and keep our programs going. And then those were things like PPE, personal protective equipment, and different strategies. So each school got to do their own decision there, and in terms of what was right for them. As Angie said, Culpeper made their decisions based on the numbers there in the locality. Some schools chose to open 100% and operate remotely. We still have that going on today. Some schools have some limited in-person. Some schools have a hybrid or blended model, and this is both in the private and public world. As I said before, my own 2 elementary students, my high school student is straight virtual, but the 2 elementary students are going to school every Thursday and Friday and are online Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Some schools have had more than one plan where they've started one way and pulled back. Several schools, districts that I know in the Shenandoah Valley, especially working with Edinburgh, have had to shift. And that ability has been put in there, and we work closely with all partners to be able to do that, because we have to make those decisions to shift between phases and shift between models as the need arises, whether that's based on what's happening in the school in terms of spread and numbers, or what's happening in the community. And so that ability, and we'll see more later throughout all of this, to be flexible, be adaptable, and make those shifts has been huge as we really put the safety and health of students at the forefront.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the journey here in Culpeper. We had a school board meeting on July 27th where our reopening plan was approved. Parents were given the choice of a 2-day in-person experience with 3 days of remote learning, or a 100% remote instructional option. And then for our special education students in the alternate assessment programs, those are students that have significant cognitive disabilities, and typically a lot of their day is spent in a self-contained classroom. So we were able to give those students the option to come 4 days a week. Those were the only students at the opening of school who had that option. Everyone else could only attend a 2-day in-person, or like I said, the 100% remote option. Our plan included no students on Wednesdays. We reserved Wednesdays for team planning, for team meetings, for a deep cleaning of the schools, and then office hours for teachers, so that students who couldn't get that one-on-one maybe help during their either A days or B days could get some one-on-one help and attention from teachers. So we have students that come on the A track, that's Monday and Tuesday, and then the B track is Thursday and Friday. And then of course we have our small number of students who can come 4 days per week. Putting this puzzle together of blended and remote with the corresponding teachers was like doing a 5,000 piece jigsaw puzzle where you lose pieces under the couch and the dog eats a piece and you can't figure out where the rest of the pieces fit. It was a real challenge trying to put that puzzle together. Before schools opened on August 24th, we had a lot of work to do. Our teachers returned on August 10th. That was the start of their contract. Many of them started really July 28th, once they knew what that plan was. In special education, especially, we had a lot of work to do because we had to hold IEP meetings for all of our students to amend the IEP for the choice that the parent had made for their child. All staff had to be trained on the health and mitigation plan, as Wade talked about a few minutes ago. We had to order PPE for all staff, and we took some additional protective measures for our teachers in those classrooms for students with significant cognitive disabilities, for our speech therapists who work closely with students, occupational therapists, physical therapists. What we also needed to do was provide training for staff on our new virtual platform, and that was brand new. So teachers had to spend a lot of time understanding how to use a complex system. Our special ed teachers also needed to have a lot of new tools that they hadn't used before, a lot of assistive technology to make that instruction, that virtual instruction, meaningful. And even though we had given our students with significant cognitive disabilities the option to attend 4 days a week, about 40% of those parents did choose to have their students have 100% remote instruction at home. So that was a real challenge, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Here in Culpeper, back in the fall a year ago, we had made some decisions about getting a new IEP system and some new reading programs. And had I known that COVID was coming down the pike, I never would have made those kinds of changes, but we had already done it. And so when teachers returned in August, we had to train them in new reading programs and on a new IEP system. So we had a lot of work to do in a very short amount of time. And I don't know, before we go to that next slide, I don't know if you can see the picture that we have. I think our screens may be blocking part of it, but it's the picture of a fire hose. And I think that's how a lot of people felt, that that water was on full blast and it was coming at them. And it was, you know, you've heard the expression, trying to drink from a fire hose. That was a good analogy. So these next two photos are actual pictures from one of our alternative assessment classrooms. You can see that it doesn't look a whole lot different than it normally does, but instead of working at a table with all children together, we have individual learning stations. You can see in the photos that there is a plexiglass shield between the student and the teacher. That's because we do a lot of very close work, and it's not always possible to have physical distance, and so we put some mitigation plans in place. You can't really tell from this photo, but in the photo on the left, the teacher that's working on the right with the blue sweater, she's actually online. She's working with students in the virtual world at the same time that instruction is happening in the classroom. And we found that it's difficult to know, should we do all virtual with one teacher, or should we just have in-person in one classroom? And in the end, we wanted to keep children with their teachers and at their home schools, whether they were in person or virtual. And so our teachers, many of our teachers, are juggling students in the classroom along with students in the virtual world.
And I'll say that decision has been really difficult. You're right. It's like that puzzle piece you were referring to, Angie. Even in the private sector, you know, the students that want to be virtual, the students that are coming, and then the limited staffing we all have to make this work has been a big challenge. And lots of ways to slice it, but you know, just trying to figure out what works has been a challenge. You know, Charterhouse's journey is interesting, and I was called the tale of two, but maybe really three campuses. And as I was thinking about this, it really symbolizes, I think, a little bit of the struggle throughout the state with different localities, different numbers, different systems, different programs, and the different decisions that had to be made. You know, with Edinburgh up in Shenandoah County, we decided back August 31st to open in person for 5 days a week. Our schools, you know, the therapeutic private day schools already have a small student to staff ratio. So that we already fared well for us in terms of the mitigation strategies and the number of people in a classroom. So that was part of the easy work. But that was based on just the local data and decisions by the school divisions back in August. Those localities were seeing a lot less of a per capita spread. You know, schools were more open to opening, either full or by hybrid models. And so we followed that, and we've done that. And we've been open there since then, and things have gone very well. Now, since then, we see some public schools in that area going back to virtual because of number of cases with staff or students in that school. So, you know, watching from the outside, we keep looking and saying, all right, when do we make those same decisions? What do we have? But so far, knock on lots of wood, it's been really a great situation there in Edinburgh. So we opened fully in person there. Our students, we opened a little bit differently. We run a departmentalized special education model. And what that essentially means is that our students switch classes, except for the elementary level, but the middle and high school, they have an English, social studies, math, and science teacher. So they're not in one class for the whole day. But when we came back, part of the mitigation strategy was that we had to keep them self-contained. So each classroom, as the staff up there talk about it, each classroom is its own little bubble. And they've actually started to, they track who breaks that bubble. So they have actually a sheet in that classroom. And if the principal comes in, if student services manager or AP comes in, therapist comes in, they actually write, okay, they've broken into that bubble and come out, so we can work on contact tracing should we need to, if anything, if we find anything there. So they're in these pods, they're self-contained. They receive content still via some virtual modes with staff in-person support. So they're there on campus, they're staying in one room with one teacher, but the other teachers have prepared lessons via Google Classroom, Edgenuity, virtual means that the students access, and they have that support from the teacher and the behavioral support staff in the classroom and the therapist, so we can actually get back to in-person there. And even there in Edinburgh, we had about 18% choose a completely virtual option. So again, how to do that while also staffing the in-person is a challenge, and we continually assess how it's going. And what's been funny there in Edinburgh is since we started, there have been about 3 or 4 of those students that and parents who've seen how it's going in person and have called and said, actually, can we come back and not do virtual and actually come to the school now that we feel you all are doing a great job with safety and health and mitigation. So that's been a good sign that we're doing some things right. The Richmond Day School, a little bit of a different story, opened 100% virtually on September 7th, and that was based on the local data there in the Central Virginia and Richmond area and the decisions of school divisions. You know, we had Chesterfield, Henrico, Richmond all starting virtually. You know, since some of those have started some hybrid, but we decided to just start all virtually. You know, the other piece there, just based on, you know, our campus and where we are, and there's a residential treatment center there, is how do we keep those things all separated and safe? So we made that decision there, but we began a staggered cohort in-person return beginning October 12th. So with new groups coming every 2 weeks. So we started with elementary coming back because we knew those kids really were craving that in-person instruction and connection. So we brought them back first, 2 classrooms only to get things started, to be sure we've got that going well. Then next was our program for students with intellectual developmental disabilities, and then our general middle and high school programs. So again, when they come back, they remain in self-contained pods and get that same sort of virtual experience with the classroom, the instruction being on the Chromebooks. They can access asynchronous and even synchronous instruction. Things like our elective teachers are zooming in, you know, to the classroom so that they're not breaking that bubble. They're actually just watching them on the screen and doing stuff there. And again, we had about 18% virtual there. Now, the third campus, we do have a residential school, part of our Child and Family Healing Center and our residential program there. One of the things that we did all along there, that the UMFS created a rapid response team to really respond to the needs we saw coming up across all of our services based on the pandemic. And one thing that we did that I know the health department has said and others that was really important is we started offering and really encouraging telework options for all support functions. That way we had fewer people coming onto campus and leaving each day. We really wanted to keep, since our day students were already virtual, we wanted to keep the Child and Family Healing Center kind of in its own bubble too. So I think that was really important. Folks that could telework should. And again, we actually pulled back and kept those same students in self-contained pods and getting virtual instruction, and then coming up with quarantine and isolation procedures should we have to do that in our units or in our classrooms. So before we opened, much like the public schools, we didn't have to hold those meetings or lead those meetings. We had to participate in lots of IEP amendment meetings, temporary learning plan meetings, so that all of our day students were prepared. We also had to coordinate transportation, which can be difficult sometimes. And based on our schedule and then other private school schedule, getting that set up, and man, our public school partners have been an excellent collaborator in that effort, and including collaborating with them for resources. You know, many helped us out with resources and some of the CARES Act funds there. We provided training for our staff. We always have about 2 weeks in the beginning of the year that we come back. And this year was different because we didn't do that in person. We had all of our staff stay home, and we did lots of Microsoft Teams and Zoom meetings to do those trainings, including the mitigation plan. PPE ordered, personal protective equipment, and increased cleaning and sanitization services across campus. And then We don't use Canvas, but we use something called Edgenuity and then Google Classroom. And we had already started that the year before, kind of having that in place for a variety of reasons. So it put us in a really good place when this happened. Even though we hadn't done it, most of our staff were used to working from an asynchronous online web-based learning platform.
So a little more about the challenges of special education in a pandemic. And I think the great thing about challenges is that you learn a lot, and out of challenges come a lot of new innovations. And I think that's what we've seen. So one of the biggest challenges that we had here in Culpeper, and as I listened to my colleagues across the state and I watched the news as you all do, convincing staff that it was safe to return to school was a huge challenge. When I look back to even a few months ago, so much was unknown. And I think there was a real fear among our staff about coming back to work in person. And obviously, we do have staff members with underlying medical conditions. We do have older teachers or teachers who live with family members with significant medical issues, and then the childcare needs. Our teachers, needed at least 3 days of, childcare so that they could be working full time. So initially, our school board, let me back up. Our school board was committed to giving teachers the option of working from home as well as giving parents that option for remote learning. So initially, we had a lot of teachers who indicated on a survey that they preferred to work from home. And the problem with that was, it was part of that puzzle was making sure that we had enough teachers who were willing to come in person to be able to teach those children who were here in person. So as the weeks went on and we prepared for school, our principals and central office staff had a lot of work to do, just having conversations with teachers, talking to them. What are your concerns? What can we do to address your concerns and help you feel more comfortable so that you can come to work? I think when you looked at an outsider looking in at the number of kids who were coming in person and the number of teachers that we had who were willing to work in person, it looked like it would all match. But then you have to look at, do we have someone licensed in algebra? That high school geometry teacher cannot teach elementary school. Teachers are licensed in very specific areas. And so making sure that we had the teachers to teach the kids in class and the kids online was a real challenge. But I'm happy to say that when we opened school on August 24th, we had the right teachers in the right classrooms with the right kids. Special education really came together. At the end of July, I was not going to be able to pull off special education in our buildings because we didn't have the right teachers willing to come in. But after a lot of work and a lot of coordination and a lot of work with that mitigation plan, most of our staff members were comfortable coming back into school. This is our 10th week of in-person school here in Culpeper. And again, we've said, knock on wood, things are going well. We have had students and staff members who have contracted COVID, but we at this point have had no spread to individuals in our schools. So all of the contraction of COVID and the spread of COVID has taken place outside of our schools. Our mitigation plan seems to be working, and we just hope that it continues that way. So we also, the challenge of preparing the physical environment and obtaining the PPE, things were hard to find. Plexiglass was scarce. We had plexiglass and disinfectant wipes were on back order for weeks, and we were concerned that, that we wouldn't be able to start school with, in the absence of some of those important PPE measures or mitigation measures. Students, We absolutely offered transportation to students who had special transportation in their IEPs, but in the absence of that, we couldn't accommodate all students on our buses and still maintain, the distance between students. Protocols had to be established for lunch and recess, bathroom breaks. This was a whole new way of doing school.
And in the private school world as well, lots of PPE ordering, figuring out what would work. We did some interesting things just trying to keep things extra safe, is installing plastic desk shields on each student desk. And these, you'll see in a minute, these look like the old folks that are old enough remember the old Trapper Keepers. And then we always got the really cheap ones because we couldn't afford the actual name brand ones. But the flimsy ones, that's what this is. And it's pretty simple. And you set it on the student's desk to keep that, to help as just another layer of mitigation. Redesigning and moving classrooms to ensure the students could fit in each classroom. And this is where that 3 feet in the red book from DOE talks about that I guess it's a 3 feet square surface when you have a desk or a desk shield and face covering. So we've taken that, and it's that, again, figuring out how do you safely social distance, and then we're going to add on top of that too. We're implementing daily health screenings for staff and students. We started this in our residential treatment program. We kept that going where, most of you all have seen this. If you go out to many places like church or any school or things like that, they ask you, all the questions about, have you been in contact with anyone? Do you have a cough and things like that? So we've been doing that for staff and students, and we actually also take temperatures just to be sure, because we've had some struggles in Edinburgh with, students coming and we're trying to be extra safe. And that's one of the challenges with, well, this kid has a fever, and then, well, that's a side effect of the medication. And then, okay, well, we need some type of documentation. And, initially some folks could get a little frustrated, but honestly, what's been great is that collaborative piece when we really talk and explain to them, we're really trying to keep things safe. And then they understand and they go and get us what we need to say that it's safe for this student to come to school. And so that's been really great to see, always the initial, I think with all of this, and Angie probably feels the same, the initial reaction after that comes through and you're able to really breathe and think it through and understand the collective good. People have really stepped up from parents. I was on a call yesterday with teachers, and they were talking about how they were addressing students who wouldn't wear masks, and that was a big concern. But the reports we're getting are that, rather than making it something punitive, which is not in our nature anyway, or having those things happen, when we are able to talk with them and use it as a learning opportunity, all the students seem to understand. Supplying, there's no shared items in some of these plans, so we had to really look at individual items for students. So how do we do that? How do we do physical restraints when it's necessary during this time period? And then how do we work with masks and students with emotional disabilities and sensory challenges? Because that's why our kids are here with us. And so that's some of the reasons we chose, and I think many private days and the like have chosen to do things like get extra mitigation, because we know our students may have some trouble with some of these expectations and requirements. And how do we work with them through that and really use it as a learning opportunity? And then again, the protocols for lunch, recess, bathroom breaks, using the playground was one that kind of came up that as we've done and everything else we hadn't considered. So looking at how do we sanitize the playground, we're keeping folks out of common areas, but how do we do that so that we can give our kids those experiences and still be safe? Here's a couple of pictures of kind of what it looks like. This is our staff getting some of our elementary students off the bus. Those yellow vests have been really cool because that's where they keep the thermometers and the paperwork and the clipboards, and we're moving to using a web-based health screening. So to have their phone or tablet or laptop out there and then help walk the kids into the building. And then here you see some of the classrooms with those Trapper Keeper-esque desk shields, but having things spread apart and keeping that going.
So one of the challenges that we had to face was, how do we take that very structured, self-contained classroom with very intensive instruction and move it into a virtual setting. And as I said earlier, about 40% of our parents of students in those self-contained intensive classrooms did decide to keep their children home. And some of the reasons were interesting. We had some parents who said, you know, I've been trying to get my child to wear a mask for the past 3 months or 5 months, and it's just not working. I'd rather keep them home instead of risking having them go to school and not wear the mask. And then a lot of parents were just concerned with health. And we do have many children with multiple disabilities that are very vulnerable health-wise. The interesting thing is that we really encourage parents, if their reason for keeping their kids at home was the mask, we encourage them to try it. Let us give it a try. You know, sometimes kids do things in school that they're not going to do at home. Sometimes when their classmates are all wearing a mask, they will as well. And so we were concerned about some of our students wearing masks, but they've really done a great job. We have not had to send one kid back to virtual learning for not wearing a mask. And we have kids who maybe don't keep it on the whole day, but they have learned to keep it on when they get up from their desk or when they're walking in the classroom or walking in the hallway. So that has really worked. So converting that self-contained classroom to a virtual schedule required a lot of collaboration with parents because, you know, the classroom was now at home. So we had to work with the parents to say, you know, what's happening in your home during the day? How much time can you support your child at home? Will this work for us to be live, you know, 3 times a day, 4 times a day in learning chunks in order to provide that instruction? So it looks different for every child, but it's figuring out, you know, the one-on-one, the small group, synchronous, asynchronous. Does the family have reliable internet? Can we come into the home? Is there a parent? You know, some of our children need parents to help them with navigating the computer. They're not able to just sit there and be independent. So a lot of considerations, and every plan looks a little bit different depending on the needs and the circumstances of the family. We also had to make sure that we got all of those instructional materials and equipment at home. And we had to do training for the parents on how to use some of those items.
Yeah, in a similar way, how would we convert a private day school to a virtual school, which was very interesting. And I think, you know, folks were wondering, how do we do this without the in-person relationship and the close contact that we are known for in that world? And so it became using new virtual instruction tools. And those tools were used not just by our teachers, but also by our therapists and behavioral support coaches. We actually, 2 of our therapists in Edinburgh created an entire social emotional learning curriculum that they did through Google Classroom with Bitmoji teachers and things like that. And how do we do that and send that to the parents? You know, for the first time ever, we sent Chromebooks home. You know, we've had them. We've had a one-to-one initiative for a while, but we always kept them at school, and it's always been a huge sort of thinking of a risk factor for sending this technology home with students for us in the private school world, especially with students with behavioral challenges. But we took that risk, we invested, and it has paid off. I think much like the masks that we're finding, we're having very little issues with that. You know, some that won't wear or have an issue, but after a while we learn through. Same thing with the Chromebooks. They've so far, knock on wood, been well taken care of. Collaboration with parents has been key. Telehealth and for therapy groups, for speech and language, for occupational therapy, doing that where we're broadcasting in the home. And then we've even been broadcasting. One of the coolest things is one thing that Charterhouse, and I know a lot of private day schools pride themselves on and work hard on, is our career and technical education, our vocational programs, and how do we prepare our students for the careers they may want and give them that experience while they're in high school and have them do some learning and see that. And we've been able to really do that in a great way. Especially our culinary teachers and our horticulture teacher have been broadcasting in. The horticulture teacher has a setup at her home with where she pots plants and all kinds of things and is broadcasting. Our culinary teacher, especially in Edinburgh, started what she called a cooking show called Chef Judy's Kitchen. And so she broadcasts in, and now that they're actually even in person, she's broadcasting into the classrooms. She's not going in, but she's down in the kitchen at the school and has it set up like a little studio. And it's so cool to see and to have that. And we're still able to do this even in this remote world. But we've had to provide a lot of behavior support to our families. You know, a lot of students still are having those challenging behaviors at home, and we've been working with those families and those students to address those even in the home environment, increasing our social emotional learning, synchronous and asynchronous instruction. And then, you know, we had began a family engagement initiatives a couple years back and providing a parent support group. And so we continue to do that virtually. And then our therapists work really hard to connect our parents to community resources, especially early on in the pandemic. We sent out a list of places and schools that were providing food, that were providing other necessary resources, places where they could get, like, you know, Xfinity and Comcast did some free internet spots, and how could they get those, and how could we direct them to the resources they would need to make this happen. Because I think, as Angie already said, you know, parental partnership is the key, has been the key to this as we've been in this particular environment. And not just with students with limited or no internet, but even those with internet access. Our program for kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities, I was blown away. We all thought going into this back in March and April, and as it continued, that would be the group that would struggle the most with this. And really, I got to see videos and sit in on classes where that group was so fully engaged with that teacher. That teacher was so creative, but a lot of it took the parent partnership or someone being there. And those kids were fortunate to have that, the ones that did. So having someone in the home has been key, in working with them and helping them get the skills and giving those skills and those resources to our parents. So we did simplified and weekly schedules and lesson plans. The public schools did it as well. I received them for my own children from the public schools, and helping the parents create that structure. We had a lot of students that didn't have internet access. And so, you know, we would email or download materials. And I know several schools did this. I think Culpeper did this with downloading them onto the Chromebook and sending it home. We would mail packets out or drop them off and have drop-off days and locations. And then teachers and paraeducators and aides and supports would call the home just to check in and see how they're doing if these kids weren't able to get on an actual Zoom call or Google Meet.
Yeah, that's so true. And, you know, unfortunately, here in Culpeper, we're a rural area, and we've got places in our county that, you know, there just is no internet. So we did give out hotspots, and we worked with Comcast to provide some coverage for families so that they could have the internet, but there are still places in our county with no internet. So that's been a big struggle for those families. So we talked a little bit earlier about filling those learning gaps. We know that kids had huge learning gaps from school being closed in the spring. And the Virginia Department of Education gave us a guidance document on what they're calling COVID recovery services, knowing that some kids are going to need additional support to close the gap. So assessment has always been important. Collecting data has always been important, but it's even more important now because we've really had to figure out, first of all, what are those gaps? What are the areas that students regressed in? And then after the first 8 weeks of school, so in the past week or two, our teachers are now looking at that data and determining whether those gaps have been filled. Are we on our way to filling those gaps? Are kids making progress to closing the gaps that were created from school being closed? And then IEP teams have to meet to determine if not compensatory services, but COVID recovery services are needed for the student. These services, though, can't be provided inside the school day because that would increase their special education percentage, and that would impact the least restrictive environment. So as we've been working with families and working with IEP teams, most of our families and IEP teams have opted to wait until we can be in person again and then provide that additional service as a kind of home-based instruction after school and on weekends to give those kids that extra instruction. I've been really pleasantly amazed, though, as Wade said, our students with intellectual disabilities and significant cognitive disabilities, I really expected those kids to have huge learning gaps, and it's been amazing how quickly they've adapted to being back in school, and then they've been able to regain skills and move forward progressing. So that's been a pleasant surprise in all of this. Attendance has been another constant challenge, and I know our school social workers, I think, are online today listening to this, and they've been kind of, this has been something they've been working with on a daily basis. It's really hard to take attendance with virtual instruction, especially when that instruction is asynchronous and not synchronous. So you don't necessarily know if the kids are plugged in. So we've been taking attendance more by completion of work, completion of assignments. But it's been difficult. We've got some kids who are not engaged at all. They're not logging in. We don't know always what's happening at home because we don't have that teacher in the home or student in the classroom. As Dr. Underwood mentioned this morning, you know, there are all kinds of things happening in homes. And unfortunately, I think that COVID has really made that gap bigger between families that have resources and families that don't have resources. Some of our families are just struggling to get by. Maybe they've lost their jobs. They're struggling with substance abuse, you know, domestic abuse, other issues. Now they've got their children at home, at least for part of the week. And in some cases, parents are stretched thin and they're not able to collaborate with us, and they're not able to really help us with that engagement and that plugging into school that we would like.
Yeah, Angie, it's interesting. It kind of brings us back to that first quote we opened up with, like a new sense of understanding, because even in this era, as we've started, even folks with resources are stretched thin and struggling. And so to imagine and have empathy for, you know, those that don't, and know that, hey, we could be there quickly. So, and then addressing behavior in a virtual setting has been interesting because, you know, you've seen a lot of students that still have those behavioral issues at home and some that don't. So it's been an interesting opportunity to address some of those. And so, you know, some of these most behaviorally challenged students are 100% virtual, had been, and some continue to be. And then those goals for behavior still need to be addressed virtually. They don't just go away. As Angie said earlier, we're not allowed to hit pause on them, even back in March and April. So we continue to, again, have a critical piece of parent partnership and consult with parents and give parents strategies. Our therapists and our behavioral support coaches have worked really hard through this to work with those parents and talk with them about what they're seeing in the home and what they're dealing with, and give them the strategies that we were using when they were in person in the school, and to use those in the home. And that's been a real benefit of this is, you know, before we would work to get parents engaged, and you know, we have things like our parent groups and our parent associations, and we'd work to try to give them some education and give them some of the skills and share with them some resources. And, you know, there was limited participation. And since this has begun, there's been an increase in participation in those groups. And then parents are getting this on a daily basis or a weekly basis when the therapist or the behavior support coach calls them or does a Google Meet or a Zoom call with them and talks about what are you seeing in the home, and here are the things you can do, because they're typically similar to what we were seeing in school. So developing things like virtual behavior intervention plans to be used at home and adapted. And then again, you know, there were times with the phone calls and the meetings with support staff and with therapists, but then also for a few, we would literally visit the home and talk through what could be done there. And then data collection. We still had to collect data. You know, nowhere is this more important than the VAP process, the alternative assessment process, mainly for our students with more intellectual and developmental disabilities. But once again, bringing those parents in as true partners, giving them data collection sheets with instructions. Our support coaches, and I'm sure other behavioral aides and instructional aides, would take data virtually. They would be on the call, the Google Meet or the Zoom call with the whole class, and would be watching and taking data on engagement, disruption, things like that. And we were able to do it. And utilizing those paraeducators, and then making it simple. You know, how can we make it simple for parents, and how can we make it simple for our staff to really manage in this new environment, in this new sort of mode we're in?
So there's been lots of lessons learned. And I think the first one is a little bit humorous, because if we didn't have enough educational jargon already, now we have new words like synchronous, asynchronous, pivot. I couldn't even pronounce synchronous and asynchronous back in May and June when we started seeing those words. But you know, wash your hands, Zoom, mute your mic. I think mute your mic or turn on your mic is said 1,000 times a day in every school.
And I think I learned that sanitation and sanitization are two different things. That was my learning.
I don't know that. You have to tell me that. Again, we've both talked about the importance of parent partnership. Parents are overwhelmed with this new reality. You may be a parent. My kids are grown. I am, and one of my daughters is a teacher. So it's been really interesting for me to relate to her and her experiences with COVID. But you know, it's just a new way of doing everything. And we really have just tremendously increased the amount of support and the amount of resources that we're providing to parents, and still trying to figure out, you know, what is it that parents really need? What can we provide? One thing that we do know is that parents need to be heard and understood. You can't just, you can't just go into their home virtually. That's a big deal. There's a lot of trust involved with going into a home virtually, where you can see the other family members, you hear the other family members, you see that living room or that bedroom where that child is working. So the best case scenario is that parents are our co-teachers. We really rely on them. And the worst case scenario is that parents just aren't engaged, and that's for many reasons. And when parents aren't engaged, usually then the students aren't engaged either. So I spoke a minute ago about just increasing our parent support, parent workshops. Can you go to the next slide, Wade? Thanks. So we've done a lot of virtual parent workshops. We started out in August doing one every week. And we used to struggle to get 4 or 5 parents to attend a parent workshop. And we felt good about that because we knew those parents wanted to be there and they were getting something from it. When we started doing parent workshops in August, we were getting 200 parents registered for our workshops. And as time has gone on, that's decreased a little bit, but we've really been committed to providing supports and information and resources for parents.
And we found too that there are opportunities in this, and some students do better in a virtual or blended model. Some kids have a greater comfort level with technology than with groups of people. For us, nowhere has this been more apparent in 2 of our programs. We have some small specialty classrooms for students with lower needs autism, and then we have a college support program we run called Courage to Succeed for young people that have neurological differences and autism that are going to college. And we've had students in both of those programs who, when we were in person, our peer support groups and our therapy groups, our social skills groups, they rarely participated in. And when we moved to virtual, The screen created the sense of comfort, and we had students who rarely talked, just talking our ears off, blossoming in this sort of new technology, because that's what they were comfortable with. That's the world outside of school that they lived in. And so, there's been a lot of talk amongst us about how do we capitalize on that going forward. We've seen this. How do we bring that in as we continue to move forward? So really neat to see. More one-to-one time with adults, because you're checking in on them individually without the disruption of other people. Our students that have anxiety, especially social anxiety or school phobia, are able to engage more because they're not having to take that step. And at least it's a way to get them boosted, give them more of an opportunity first, and increase that confidence before they actually have to come into the school environment. So we've talked a lot about things like, could this be sort of a homebound of the future, doing some things virtually, especially for kids that are on homebound for behavioral reasons? Could we use it as an opportunity to start students off in a mode like this, especially those with high levels of anxiety, and then bring them in to those school environments? So how do we capitalize on these findings? Having fewer kids in a virtual environment or a blended environment creates less peer pressure, less negative behaviors in the classroom. We've even noticed at Edinburgh, who's been essentially fully in that, and this not so much with the virtual or blended model, but just I think having the pandemic going on and having to remain self-contained and do school a little bit differently. Yesterday, we were looking over data. They've reported a significant increase in serious incident reports, or SIRs, throughout this first quarter of the school year, a significant drop. And so we're talking about, okay, what learnings can we take from that to continue on into the future? We see increased participation in therapy in groups, especially with them being online. And then the pace of the curriculum, and this is something that every special educator will agree with, our students are expected to continue the pace with everyone else in the general curriculum. And at times, special educators wish we could slow it down a little bit more and really do that. And this particular virtual or blended model has actually allowed us to do that. And I think we feel that kids are getting it more. Kids are understanding the most important concepts at a much deeper and better level than they ever were before. So it's been a really great opportunity to do that. And then to work on some of the challenging behaviors, even while things are sort of being at home or calm and not in the environment with a lot of stimulation and potentially a lot of triggers.
I'm just going to jump in here and say that I love doing classroom visits right now.
Yes.
Because it is so quiet and calm and peaceful in our schools. I just want to echo everything that Wade said on that last slide.
Yeah, it's been pretty incredible. And again, knocking on wood, it continues to do that as we continue to move forward. But I think all of us are gathering up all the lessons we're learning in this time period and going, how can that inspire and inform the special education of the future? And in this too, just this importance of public and private school partnership, working on those IEP amendments, working up through transportation challenges, looking at funding and resources, understanding the need for private day services and specialized services. Even when we're in a virtual environment, like back last spring, we had to go there. And I think everyone really sees that value at this point, that our private schools, our private day schools and private special education therapeutic schools provide, even in a virtual format. Another thing too, it's not only been important to have a public and private school partnership, but this has also increased the partnership and collaboration amongst private schools. As a member of VASEF and working with that accreditation committee, we do have a lot of collaboration that happens over the year, but really with this pandemic, there's a group of us in Central Virginia that include a Dominion Academy, St. Joseph's Villa, Faison and Keys Academy, Virginia Home for Boys and Girls, and John G. Wood School, that get together about every couple of weeks on a call just to say, hey, what's going on with you all? What lessons can we learn from each other as we all navigate through this? So once again, collaboration definitely multiplying impact. And then, you know, we've talked about being flexible and creative. I mean, one of the big things with COVID and, you know, with schools and of course, teachers are always great at creating resources, you know, and trying to find a cheap way to create those resources. And many times that's through shared resources. And one of the key elements of that red book and health mitigation plans is we don't share things. We don't, which is the opposite of what we teach everyone in kindergarten, right? But we don't share our materials and our items. So we've had things in our in programs across the state for kids with autism and other sensory needs. We've had sensory rooms where there's all shared items. So we've had to be really creative, and everyone has, and create individual sensory bins for home use and for classrooms, dropping them off. Things like visual schedules and supports for students that we may have shared previously. We've had to send those home and be creative and really find how do we still provide all of these items even within this pandemic.
So we've had new opportunities for partnerships, and here in Culpeper, one of the most exciting things that we have done is entered into a partnership with the University of Virginia. They are used to sending teachers, not teachers, they are used to sending their students in teacher preparation programs into schools to do practicums, and they haven't been able to do that this fall because most of the schools around UVA and Charlottesville are still doing virtual instruction. And I think for some reason it just wasn't working with those schools. So they've partnered with us to provide one-on-one virtual tutoring using an evidence-based practice reading intervention. And that has just been really, really nice. It's been kind of the icing on the cake because it's providing additional support for our struggling readers. And there's something about a young, 20-something student on the other side of that screen that our kids really respond well to. So that's been one of the partnerships that's come about from the pandemic, and it's benefited both UVA and our students. One of the things that we've learned is that teachers need emotional support, and we were very, very concerned about our students and our families, and we were concerned as well about our teachers, but I think until our teachers actually came back, I don't think we realized quite the support that they were going to need. In the beginning, I think there was the fear of catching the virus, just anxiety with all the new demands and all the things that they needed to learn that were brand new. Teachers are working longer hours. Teachers have always worked long hours, and you may see them leaving the school at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, but they're not going home to relax. They're going home and they're doing more work, recording those lessons that they need for kids who don't have the internet, reworking their lesson plans in a way that they didn't have to before. In some cases, there's a lack of community support. Here in Culpeper, our Board of Supervisors, who funds our local budget, was not very keen on funding us if we weren't going to open in person. And even now there's some rumbling that they don't know why they should be funding us at the same level as in previous years because we don't have the same number of students in school for 5 days a week. And that's demoralizing for teachers and for staff. And it really, that's something that they shouldn't have to think about or even know about. But that's part of the reality, the political reality, I guess, right now. And then balancing their caregiver needs with their own children, with their job. So we have opened up daycare for staff children on those 3 days of remote learning so that they have a place for their children to go that's safe and they can do their remote learning. And I think one of the quotes that I hear a lot and I think about a lot, and I think it's true even for me in my 33rd year of public education, every teacher is a first-year teacher this year. And I look at our new teachers and I think in some ways they're almost adapting easier because they don't know the difference. So they're coming in and thinking this is this is what teaching is all about. But our veteran teachers are really having to learn a whole new way of doing things.
And Angie, I'd love to just say you're exactly right. You know, teachers who go home, and always been the case at 3 or 4 o'clock, they're planning into the evening in a normal environment. And you know, as you mentioned, you know, the amount of funds and the amount of time and resources that it takes to do virtual education well, whether that be synchronous or asynchronous, is a lot more than in person. And there's lots of research to show that. And I think everyone now, as we've been in this for a while, is coming to that same conclusion: is this takes a lot more planning and a lot more effort on that end, because you're not there in the classroom to make those split-second kind of decisions. It takes a lot of planning up front.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for reinforcing that idea. And I don't think we knew that until we actually got into it. It's unbelievable, the additional resources that are needed. So to support teachers, we've started doing a lot of workshops. Our social workers, again, have been doing almost weekly workshops for teachers after school that have been well attended, just helping them to manage stress and anxiety and how to partner with parents. Just the reality of teaching in a pandemic, what that means. And we've been recording those workshops, and we want to make them available to teachers so that they can access them on demand on their own time as well.
And sort of, where do we go from here? You know, you've heard a lot already about lessons we've learned that I think will inform the future of special education and education in general. And how do we maximize some of these tools we've been, you know, forced to use? You know, this crisis has created a lot of invention and ingenuity. So how do we use that going forward as one? And I think you've heard a lot of that today between the virtual methods and parent engagement and whatnot. But, you know, we may be here for a little while, right? So we're heading into flu season. We're heading into more spikes and some worsening of the pandemic. And I think what's been really great is IEPs were written with a backup for 100% virtual if we have to shut down again. I think teachers are more prepared. Excuse me?
If we have
oh yeah, you got to pivot. Absolutely. You have to pivot. And I think what's cool is as we're even in hybrid models in public school, and then even in some of these self-contained models we're using in the private world that are a little different, that we're more ready. I know for my staff at Charterhouse, we've talked about, look, we want to don't stop doing the virtual instruction even though we're in person. If you're in the classroom, we're still using our Google Classrooms, our Edgenuity, because at any moment we could have to go back, and we don't want to have that huge pivot, a smaller pivot when that happens. You know, we want to be able to quickly move back and kind of keep things flowing, not just for our teachers and staff, but for our kids. So they're used to this. They're used to, this is the way we do school. So, you know, if we have a classroom that has to go back to virtual because there's been a positive case in there, we can just take that classroom and go. If the governor comes in and says, hey, we've got to go back again, or we decide as any school we have to move to virtual, that it's not as much of a pivot. And I think that's really important. And I think that's something that has been wise of many school districts and private days to be ready for.
I think we're at our time to end, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but some real benefits that have come out of the way we do business now is we have increased parent attendance at meetings. We've eliminated driving time for staff. I'm amazed at how much additional time I have been able to find in my schedule because I'm not driving to meetings within the district and outside of the district. Just that increased focus on parent communication and collaboration, the new emphasis on mental health for all of our students and our staff, just the really making virtual learning into a very effective method for many of our students. Better hygiene practices. We're hoping that the spread of other illnesses will be decreased in the coming years because we have really learned how to mitigate the spread of disease. And the new partnerships hopefully will continue. And teachers absolutely have new tools in their toolboxes. So I think there is a lot of hope and a lot of things that we're going to take from this pandemic and we're going to implement in the future of school. It will look different in the coming years. So Scott, do we need to stop?
Well, I'm going to turn it over to Zandra because she's got some questions for you.
Okay.
And thanks, guys, for an awesome presentation.
Wonderful. I believe you can hear me, and pretty soon you'll be able to see me. I've started my video, but thank you so much, Angie and Wade, for those practical as well as thoughtful comments and how-tos that you presented. So I'm going to follow up with some questions about that. One of our first questions that we received was, does the federal government accept adherence to the temporary learning plans as acceptable, or just the same as adhering to the IEP?
No.
Oh, okay.
The temporary learning plan was not an IEP. And so really in the spring, this is a little bit hard to explain and we don't have a lot of time, but just in summary, in the spring when schools closed down, if, you know, the responsibility for special education was to provide the same opportunity as other students. So because we didn't have new instruction going on, and because we were continuing to provide some services, we were not technically out of compliance. And that was another reason why a lot of us did the temporary learning plans. However, now we can't do the temporary learning plans because they are not a legal document like the IEP. So.
Well, that was a great question and a great answer. Thank you. One of the participants, you know, a lot probably have been wondering, are there any suggestions on how vendors in the CSA system can provide support to children and families as they, you know, need to adjust schedules over time as we deal with the pandemic?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities. You know, I've heard of a lot of folks, especially providing community-based services, you know, to those students and families. If they're not in school and they don't have the services that like a private day therapeutic school provides, as we're reaching out with our own therapists and our own support coaches, we've got plenty of other families in the public school who really count on school for some of those social emotional needs and mental health and wellness needs, and they're not there. So I wonder if there are vendors who could offer those, whether it be in-home or therapy or anything like that, to support those families. Because, you know, the one place that, you know, we've always said this for access to services like that, there's two places where every kid and family goes. That's the doctor's office and the schools. So, you know, right now you're not going to the doctor's office very much either. So I think vendors could really have an opportunity there to help with some of those needs that are getting missed.
Well, you bring up actually the subject of one of the next questions, and that's, you know, how are issues about equity and access being addressed or, you know, handled during this time, particularly with the needs of special needs education? Any comments or response to that?
That's a great question, Sandra. And I think, you know, the biggest equity issue I think that impacts us right now is the lack of internet in many homes, and that's very difficult. So, you know, we've worked with Comcast and we've tried to, as much as possible, get internet into homes that didn't have it. But like I said, there's some parts of our county that are very rural and just don't have the capacity for internet. So that takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of communication and collaboration with parents. And those are the kids that are going to need more support and more COVID recovery services to make up for this lost time. And it really all, you know, like I said, I think we're seeing some of those gaps widen between the families that are able to support their children during this time and those who aren't. And that's where I think our reliance on our community agency partners and our private partners is so important, because we do have a lot of needs in the community with those families to help support them so that they can support their children with education.
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy fix to that. You know, it's really hard, and I think it takes that those honest conversations with collaboration and no shame, no blame, and let's figure out, be creative, and let's open up that opportunity to be creative and figure it out together.
Absolutely. So another question from a participant was, do you have any suggestions for educating aggressive children whose disabilities simply cannot be addressed by online learning?
Well, I know the way, you know, we've tried to work with that is, as we shared in the presentation, through working with that parent, trying to give some supports and resources to that parent, the virtual behavior intervention plan, essentially taking the same behavior intervention plan we'd be using in school and translating that for home so that we can give them that resource and work with the parent. Again, just work with them to help with those needs. If there's opportunities for us to somehow visit the home with safe measures in place, look at that. If it's coming in virtually, if they're open to that, doing that. But really in the end, how do we help the parent create an environment and create some structure as the same as they would have at school when they are not able to, which has been the push too, to bring some of these kids back, to be honest. And
Right.
even though it's challenging and can be seen as risky, I was talking about this the other day. Someone said, well, why wouldn't we just stay virtual? Well, this is part of why there are lots of things we can do virtually, lots. And man, have we realized that during this time period. At the same time, we've got kids that, though they're still progressing and doing well, need to come back, need to do that so we can really especially hit those behavior goals.
Yes.
Exactly.
And we've really been relying on the community agency support. So in-home workers and, other service providers have really partnered with us well to assist with the behavior at home.
Excellent. Excellent. Let's see. One of the questions, can you or will you address, please, eligibility requirements for SPED during COVID? Is there anything different, unique? What can you tell us about that?
That is a great question, and we probably don't have time to fully explore that. But we have a lot of students right now who are struggling, who have missed a lot of instruction. And one of the requirements for special education eligibility is to ensure that students have had high quality instruction. So we have to look at things that would exclude students from special ed eligibility, such as attendance and a lack of instruction and those kinds of things. So it's tricky right now because we have entire school divisions of children who are falling behind because of the time that they missed in the spring, or maybe now if they're not fully engaged in virtual learning. So we've had a lot of meetings with parents and school staff to kind of explore all of that, really try to drill down to find out what was happening pre-COVID, what's happening now. So we're still evaluating students for special education, but it does add another wrinkle of complexity to that whole discussion, because we do need to make sure that that the primary reason for their struggles right now isn't that lack of instruction from the spring or the challenges that we're experiencing right now with instruction.
Right. Excellent. An issue was raised about, prevention is always best, but and needed. Can you talk a little bit about how prevention might play a part, and what are some, maybe practicalities in addressing a truant student? What, are there any helpful hints, suggestions, lessons learned that you might be able to share addressing that concern?
I'm thinking probably truant students in the virtual sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably both. I mean,
Yeah.
truant students, and then there's some who don't show up for class, right?
Yeah. So I know, from a private day perspective, one thing we've always worked to do is when we're in person is doing things like home visits and reaching out. And, once we can get the student in, typically the environment that meets their needs, for belonging and such, really helps have them, changes that motivation to be there. But at first, if they're not showing up, it's taking that extra step of going out. And visiting with them, sending a counselor, a therapist, and a support coach out just to see what's going on. In the virtual world, that's been more difficult. And really what we've relied on there has been, again, the parent collaboration. I think, as Angie also said, that collaboration with other providers, like they have in-home workers who may still be going in or doing more virtual, maybe have built a different relationship with that kid and that family. And get their help to just work together and help get them online, help get them in the classrooms. I mean, we've had some, public school partners have too, that wouldn't engage, that wouldn't log on. And then there have been some we've been able to bring in and a few we haven't. But I think the efforts there are to continue to reach out, to continue to provide those supports, and then see if we can get someone out there to meet in person.
One of
That's
the things
great.
One of the things that's helped us is when parents have seen the interim report cards and realized that their high school kids especially, aren't logging on, aren't doing those assignments. So that has been a little bit of a wake-up call for some of our families. And then our principals at our high schools have done a good job of trying to invite those kids back in for blended instruction, the ones that were on 100% remote and just aren't engaged, because we have some room in our high schools. We can absorb more students in person. So we've had several students just in the last week or two who have returned to school, and that there's just probably a lot more accountability within in-person instruction than virtual. But it's a tricky challenge.
I just want to make sure we are getting close to our time, but I did receive a question. Will you be sharing your virtual behavior intervention template? Or is that available someplace? That was a question.
I'm happy to share ours. Wade, I think, do you have one as well?
Yeah, and it's essentially for us the same thing that we would use in person. We have one that we use that's connected to one of our core sort of philosophies. So I'd be happy to.
Excellent, excellent. Well, on behalf of everyone here, I just want to thank you. That was a most informative session with really practical and innovations and solutions to the challenges that everyone is facing now. Any last comments? I can give you an opportunity to say anything else that you'd like to, but thank you both for participating. This has been an excellent session, and I just thank you and commend you.
Well, thank you for having us, and just I think as we continue to go forward, working through this together and collaborating and trying to find creative solutions to the problems we're facing.
Great. Well, thank you so much. At this time, we have concluded our planned presentations and sessions for the day. I want to thank each and every one of you who have participated by viewing, by sending excellent questions. I just want to let you know that today's sessions are being recorded, so they will be available at a future date on the OCS website, www.csa.virginia.gov. So please be sure to look for that in the future. I want to thank each and every one of you. We've had over 950 to 960 participants, which is a definite record-breaking attendance level for us. Thank you for your time, but don't leave just yet. As you know, Scott mentioned that we were having some giveaways through the generous support of I want to also remind you of our vendors and sponsors who have persevered through this virtual environment and continue to support our annual conference and these efforts. I'd like to thank our impact sponsors. And as you see in the program, there is an opportunity to visit with sponsors beginning at 12:15. That'll be, they'll have individual Zoom rooms. Our impact sponsors will. So please, please take time, stop by. There might be a few surprises and some fun things planned. And as they continue to make the conference unique, fun, and engaging. Even through this time of social distancing, this is one way that we'd like to continue that. So also our community sponsors have continued to provide support for this conference. And if you go to page 7, you'll find instructions on the visits. But if you go to the individual pages, the sections where there are logos for each sponsor, if you click on the logo, you'll get information, some videos, and an opportunity to make contact and engage with them there. So we really appreciate the support of our sponsors. So those visits will go from 12:15 to 1 o'clock today. And we'll also have a slide at the end that will remind you and then go on for the stream. As Scott informed you earlier, we did have plans this year to host our conference in Norfolk, Virginia, but as the pandemic would have it, we weren't able to meet in person. However, we really do hope that 2021 will be a different year and we'll be able to meet in person. And to that end, our friends at Visit Norfolk, which is the Norfolk Convention and Visitors Bureau, they have graciously provided a wonderful gift package. I'll give you a little more detail about that. The package includes a one-night stay, complimentary stay at the Norfolk Waterside Hotel, Visit Norfolk t-shirt, travel blanket, and one thing that I would love if I were eligible to win, a lovely snow globe with the Virginia love symbol in it. But at any rate, one lucky person has been selected and you received instructions. And today's giveaway winner is Rudy Zavala. Rudy, and I know you well. Rudy, you have until 2 p.m. to claim your prize by sending an email to edinsley@vt.edu. And mention the code word for today, which is equity, in the subject line. So if Rudy does not claim that by 2 o'clock, we will be sad for him, but we will gladly we'll have to choose another winner. So be sure to do that by 2 p.m. today, Rudy. Today's been really an outstanding experience, considering that this is our first virtual statewide annual conference and the tremendous support by the vendors and every participant, the staff at Virginia Tech, all of the presenters, Dr. Underwood, Dr. Carey. It's been just transformative for me as a participant as well. So I'd like to thank each and every one of you for what you've done during the pandemic, but also what you do on a daily basis to help the families and children that are served through the system of care that CSA represents, and especially during these difficult and challenging times. So we hope that you will visit the vendors beginning at 12:15 And we hope that you will be with us tomorrow at 8:45 as we convene the second day of our 9th annual conference. If you have questions, be sure to send them to us by email. But a sincere thank you to everyone who has made this incredible day possible. So see you tomorrow. Thank you.